Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I was about 23 years old at the time and was on a fabulous beach holiday in Southern California with my two best friends, Laura Matrose and Linda Schmidt. We were lying out on our colourful swimming towels, our heads covered in floppy sun hats, our eyes sheltered behind dark sunglasses, while reading our novels, basking in the gloriously warm sunshine, while we twiddled our feet in the soft exfoliating sand of Venice Beach, enjoying the pleasure of the soft granules sloughing our feet. We watched the undulating thunderous breakers crashing to the shore, moving across the sand in soft waves that filled in the footprints where people had once walked with water just moments before, transforming them into faint holes. We marvelled at the sound of the surf crashing as it rolled towards the shore with a plethora of foaming bubbles, along with delighting in the salty smell in the air that you could even taste on your tongue, which was always nostalgic, reminding me that yes, I was on holiday, that this was my opportunity to let my hair down, to run bare feet in the soft sand with the wind blowing against my cheeks, to forget all about my job back home in Charleston. I smiled as people in the water shrieked with delight as they skipped over the waves, some daring to go deeper, to tackle the kind of waves that could duck you under, steal your breath away. It was a gloriously beautiful day. We were soaking up the sun like ravenous sponges, having lathered ourselves down heavily with sunscreen, while we watched some surfers skidding above the waves as they squatted down on their boards, in their wetsuits. They seemed to ride the waves with such an expert grace that was seamless and impressive. I didn't for a moment wish to trade places with any of them. I loved the safety of taking things easily. Risks were to be taken by people braver than myself. "Let's go into the water," I said to Laura. "I'm getting overheated." "Good idea," she said. We both ran into the water, feeling the cool surf washing against our bodies. We were both feeling exhilarated as our wet hair dangled around our faces in rats' tails. Our eyes were red from the sea salt. Our bodies glistened with the ocean spray. I could feel someone poking me in the back. It was a woman wearing a bright yellow bathing costume standing behind me. I turned around to see a woman in her early 30s. Her dark brown hair was swept back in a neat ponytail, while her olive skin was covered with a generous amount of sunscreen. Her dark brown eyes were studying me curiously, wearing an expression of grave concern. "Excuse me," she said to me in a German accent. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Greta Hoffmann. I'm a dermatologist from Frankfurt in Germany. I see that you have a mole on your back that looks very suspicious. If I were you, I would get it checked out at once." "You think it could be malignant?" I asked, looking horrified. "Let's just say that I would have it checked out if I were you." "Thank you," I said. "Thank you so much for telling me. It's a pleasure. I hope that it is nothing to worry about." "What was that all about?" my friend asked, having seen me engaged in a conversation with the German tourist. "What did that woman say to you? I saw your face growing as white as a sheet." "She was warning me about this mole I've got here on my back," I exclaimed, showing it to her. "The woman is a dermatologist from Frankfurt in Germany. She says I need to get it checked out. She says it looks suspicious. She freaked me out, I'm telling you that." My friend examined my mole. "Well, it does look a bit odd. It is uneven and misshaped, and it has got different shades of colour to it." Suffice to say, that evening in our hotel room, I spent the entire night looking up information about malignant melanomas. I began to realise that my mole looked uncannily similar to the visual examples that had been displayed. I could see my friends' anguished, worried looks as they encouraged me to cut my holiday short in order to get my mole examined by an expert. "Please go home," they begged me. "You need to get that mole checked out as soon as possible." So unfortunately, that glorious holiday spent in the sunshine with my two best friends was ruined for me. All I could think about was returning to West Virginia and booking an appointment to see a dermatologist as soon as I possibly could. My dermatologist took one look at my mole and cut it out. The tissue biopsy was then sent to a laboratory. I was to soon learn the dreadful news that I did indeed have the dreaded malignant melanoma. It hit me hard like a kick to the guts. It felt as if my whole world had fallen apart. I was completely dumbfounded. If it hadn't been for that random encounter on the beach with that dermatologist from Frankfurt, I may never have had the mole checked out at all. I could be walking around obliviously unaware that a rampant cancer was growing inside me. A week later, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room for my turn to see the doctor. I glanced around at all the people waiting to see him first, and pondered if they also had cancer. People were just staring into space absently, their faces devoid of any expression. I wondered what they were going to see the surgeon about. What kind of thoughts were whirling around their mind? Were they afraid like I was? I'd never for a moment believed that cancer would ever brush my life. It was something that invariably always happened to other people, but not to me. But now I was beginning to realize that I was as vulnerable as the next man to getting ill. When I entered the waiting room after speaking to the receptionist on duty and registering my appointment with her, I couldn't help but notice a headboard on the wall of handwritten letters and cards, all written to the doctor that I was about to visit. I had a glimpse at some of the cards out of a heightened curiosity. "Dear Dr. Miller, I want to thank you for all you did for my mother while she was alive." And another note had read, "Thank you for improving the quality of my sister's life after her melanoma diagnosis." After that, I couldn't read any more notes. They screamed in my head like ambulance sirens. I was now petrified about what the doctor was going to tell me. It would seem that being diagnosed with malignant melanoma was really, really serious stuff. The receptionist called out my name. "Pamela McGee?" I looked up and nodded, putting down the magazine I'd been pretending to read for half an hour, which was on a page where there was an ad for a protein powder for men guaranteed to grow your pecs 3 times the size. I cast the magazine to one side and got up from my seat. "The doctor will see you now," she said. I nodded and managed to stand up. Every part of me was wobbling with anxiety. I took a deep breath and made my way to the doctor's office, terrified of what I was going to be told. How bad was my melanoma? That was the million-dollar question. For a moment I was relieved to see that the doctor wasn't there yet. I took a seat at his very grandiose walnut desk, graced by a family-framed portrait of a woman and kid smiling brightly in the lens. I glanced at the walls. They were heavily laden with impressive medical certificates that were meaningless to me, but I suppose very impressive. Obviously this doctor knew his stuff, so I was in good hands, if that was any consolation. Then I saw him. He was tall, dark and slender. He entered the room and made his way to the desk, taking a seat. He was a very smart, elegant man, turned out in a stylish pinstriped shirt and cream pants, with smart leather shoes. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Dr. Miller. Pleased to meet you." "You are?" "I'm Pamela McGee." "That's right. I have your name here on the file. You're Pamela McGee. You're 23 years old." "That's right." There was a long drawn-out silence as I watched the doctor read through my file. He looked up at me, his steely grey eyes meeting mine, and said, "Why did you leave it so long?" "You mean the mole?" I asked flatly. He nodded. Oh my God! I thought he was about to tell me that the cancer had spread all over my body. I felt as if I was swallowing a soccer ball as I choked out the words. I didn't even notice it. It was on my back. Someone pointed it out to me at the beach. Good thing they did, said the doctor. I hate to have to tell you this, but you have stage 3 melanoma. What does that mean? It means that we need to operate to remove some lymph nodes to see if the cancer has spread anywhere else in your body. From then we will know what protocol to follow. We will also be removing extra tissue around the site of the melanoma to ensure that we have extracted all the cancer so that nothing will spread. Will I have a large hole on my back? That should be the least of your worries, young lady, but a cosmetic surgeon will help in ensuring that your scars are inconspicuous. We will make it as neat as possible for you. That had happened a whole year ago. Time certainly flies by fast. I'd been incredibly fortunate. Luck had been smiling down on me, as after an operation followed by rigorous testings on their findings after surgery, it would seem the cancer had not reached my lymph nodes, so I was now declared cancer-free. But of course I did need regular checkups to ensure I didn't have any other cancerous moles or growths. So when I was about 30 years old, my job in Charleston, West Virginia, had become incredibly flexible, which meant I could work from home. So I decided to move to my grandmother's farm, an hour from Charleston. She had built a little cottage on the farm so that I could live in the countryside with them, but also have my own space and independence. The cottage was so beautiful. It had been built in a prime location overlooking a silvery pond, where all kinds of stunning bird and waterfowl would congregate. After my scary experience with malignant melanoma, I'd come to realize what the most important things in life are. Cancer has a way of putting things in perspective for you, making you access what really counts in your life. It was a marvellous idea that had been my grandmother's suggestion, as I'd grown up on that farm with both of my grandparents. As far as I was concerned, it was the most magical place in the entire world, where all my finest, most beautiful memories were birthed. I'd grown up without a father, as my mother claimed that on a trip to Paris she had met a Frenchman, drunk way too much, and spent an evening of passion with him. It was only when she returned to America that she discovered she was pregnant with me, but she had no way of tracing down my real father. So I can safely say that I'm possibly half French. While I was growing up, my mother was gallivanting around the globe as an international photographer, taking pictures of world events from war-torn parts of the world to exotic places. She took pictures for newspapers and glamorous publications like National Geographic. Due to my mother's high-profile career, I barely got to see her, and in truth I consider my grandmother to have been the real role model in my life, for she was there for me, whenever it really mattered, to nurse the scrape on my knee when I took a tumble, or to calm me down with a glass of warm milk when I was having a nightmare. My mother breezed into my life like a captivating, exotic, colourful butterfly that darts from flower to flower and then flies away. It's an age before you see that butterfly again, even though you never forget it, as it makes an indelible impression on you that you simply can't forget. She would bring us fabulous gifts from far-flung, isolated foreign and uncharted locations that she visited, but then she would be gone again. It was like she had itchy feet. She could never stay still for very long. She loved nothing better than embarking upon a new adventure, and our lives in West Virginia held little allure for her. My grandparents' magnificent farm was situated on about 40 acres of sprawling land, with open flowering meadows where cows and horses would graze happily and frolic in the fields. They also owned a plethora of ducks and chickens, and 2 devoted collie dogs that followed my Gramps wherever he went. We lived in an area where many other farms like ourselves also kept horses and cows. We called the old farmhouse a Walk in the Clouds farmhouse, as we considered home to be such a dreamy place, a place where you could unwind and be yourself, a place where harsh judgments and callous criticisms abandoned you, a place where you were loved and accepted for being you. It was a double-story symmetrical brick and stone building with whitewashed walls, a terracotta roof and pretty sash windows that was built against these high undulating tree-covered hills, overlooking mesmerizing panoramic views of the countryside, where beyond the expanse of flowery meadows where the horses and cows convened, you would see verdant fields and clusters of trees, where they gathered together in congenial groups like old friends. We also had a couple of silvery ponds surrounded by weeping willows, covered in pretty water lilies. On the right-hand side of our property, the woodgrove stretched back for miles, where it continued beyond an old logging road. It was in this area that you would find the indigenous wildlife, from American beavers, chipmunks, foxes, river otters, red and grey foxes, cottontail rabbits, snowshoe hares, possums, voles, bobcats, coyotes, white-tailed deer, and the list goes on. Most of these animals have crossed my path from time to time, so I was fully aware of the vast array of vibrant indigenous wildlife that we had living among us. My grandmother was a very endearing old woman with a warm southern convivial charm and strong old-fashioned values. She ran that farm so smoothly, getting up at the crack of dawn to attend to her farm duties, like feeding the chickens, mucking out the stables, attending to the cows. And age was no barrier or hindrance to her. She was as fit as a fiddle, with the constitution of an ox, as she never got ill. While my grandfather enjoyed spending time out of doors, managing the affairs of the farm, and enjoying a spot of hunting from time to time, he had a particular affinity to bow hunting. One day I remember the next-door neighbour came to visit us. I think I was about 15 years old at the time. Her name was Nellie. She always popped around to our house for a cup of tea and a good old chinwag. That was what we did back then. Her truck rolled down our driveway. The woman got out of the door, slamming it behind her. Nellie was a woman in her early 40s, of a stocky build. She wore her hazel-brown hair in a pigtail, while her flawless sun-kissed skin had never worn a stitch of makeup a day in her life. Not even on the day she married her husband, Jed. Some said she should have been born a man, as she was all tomboy and loved nothing better than getting her hands dirty. She liked doing all those man jobs like working under engines and getting her overalls coated in oil and her face smeared with black marks. She was always a cracking shot with a rifle and considered a phenomenal hunter. I don't believe there was ever a time when I saw her wearing a dress. She always wore jeans and plaid shirts and was constantly wearing her husband's clothes. We noticed she came to our front door hobbling on a crutch this morning. She was wearing an impressive plaster cast on her foot, which we couldn't wait to sign with our colourful pens, as you did that in those days. You could scrawl cute little messages on plaster casts of any kind, so that by the time you had the cast removed, it was covered in messy scribbles. My grandmother ran out of the door to help Nellie manoeuvre herself better by linking in with her free arm and guiding her into the farmhouse. "What happened to you?" my grandmother asked her. "I broke my ankle pretty badly," Nellie told us, "but believe me, it could have been a whole lot worse. I'm so lucky to be alive. It was a narrow miss, let me tell you." "Tell me about it, Nellie," said my grandmother, placing a kettle on the hob. "Don't keep us in suspense, will you?" "I'll wait for that cup of tea before I tell anyone anything. I'm gagging for a drink this morning." Nellie took a large gulp of sweet tea, and then began to compose herself. "The trouble is," she said, "what I'm going to tell you is so bizarre. I'm not entirely sure you're going to believe me, but it is the God's honest truth. I was ploughing the field with my husband's tractor, and I got the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. It was a weird feeling, but I brushed it to one side, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. The next thing I knew is that my tractor hit a tree limb, and I went flying off the vehicle while my tractor was still moving. I was moments away from being run over by the thing. Something like this has never happened to me before. I'm normally so careful with that top-heavy tractor. Everything was happening so quickly, too quickly for me to react. I landed on the ground really hard. I could hear the crack of my bone, so I knew that my ankle was broken. The pain was excruciating. I was seconds away from being run over when I found myself being scooped up into these very long, hairy arms, where I was put out of harm's way on the far edge of the field. This thing that rescued me was like a huge, massive, bulky form of dark brown hair. I had no idea what it was. My tractor was still driving itself, so this powerful beast pushed it over on its side so that it became inoperable. I mean, who can push a tractor over like that, I ask you? The creature then glided over to me to check that I was all right. I was in a state of suspended shock, as I realized that without this anomalous creature's intervention, I would almost certainly be dead or very, very seriously injured. "What do you mean, huge, massive, bulky form of brown?" asked my mother. "This was the thing that rescued me," Nellie explained. "This was the thing that saved my life. But what it was, I couldn't tell you." "Well, what was it?" asked my grandmother. Well, I've no idea, said Nellie. It looked to be half human. It was big. This thing was easily over 8 foot tall, 3 foot wide. It had overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head. But the face on this thing was so human. The only way I can describe him to you is he was like a wild man in every regard, but so intelligent, very, very, very clever. What happened next? Asked my grandmother. Well, I tried to get up onto my feet, but I couldn't. My ankle was literally dangling off my foot. And when the strange creature saw my foot, he let out a shrill whistle, as if to say, "Wow!" It wasn't a pretty sight at all. In truth, it was really rather grisly. The creature picked me up in his substantial-sized arms and carried me to the farmhouse like a baby. He ran with me so gently, the ride was so smooth, he didn't jolt me once, nor did he appear to find me heavy. He put me down gently at the front doorstep, studying me through his dark eyes. Those eyes were so incredibly kind. It was as if he was saying, "Are you going to be all right if I leave you here on your own?" I knew my husband was out with the cows, so I perceived he'd be a while. So I pointed to my son's famous 5 book that was lying further away on the ground. The creature brought it to me. He looked at the book and the picture on the front, scratching his head as if he was wondering what the thing was. I said, "Thank you for helping me." I mean, what else could I say? The creature grunted. I do think he sensed my appreciation. I watched him gliding from the green grass of our yard, through the flowery meadow towards a cluster of trees, and then he vanished from my sight. But he moved with such a grace. I then opened my son's Enid Blyton book and began to read it. I knew it would be a while before my husband returned from working with the cows. My ankle was throbbing, but I soon forgot about it, and when my husband returned I couldn't even put that Enid Blyton book down. It was so good. I was completely gripped by the plot. He looked at my foot and asked what the hell had happened to me. I told him my bizarre story, and well, let's just say he looked incredulous. "Well, I never," he kept saying. "Well, I never." He insisted I needed to go to the hospital at once. And well, let's just say the rest is history. "But I don't understand. Why weren't you afraid of this strange creature that rescued you? By all accounts, it was massive. You don't even know what it was." I didn't have time to be afraid. Everything happened so fast, like it does in a road traffic accident. It felt like a long time, but in reality it only took a few seconds. I couldn't even meditate on anything that was happening to me. The creature had whisked me up in his arms. It felt surreal, as if I was caught up in a dream. So I guess my ability to react was suppressed, as it is when you're in a dream state. But when I realized that this thing was helping me, I wasn't afraid anymore. When my grandfather came home that night for dinner, my grandmother could not wait to tell him about Nellie's remarkable story. "You're not going to believe it, Johnny, but I've got a weird tale for you that you're going to find so shocking." "I'm not easily shocked, woman," my grandfather teased, as he tucked into his mashed potato and chicken casserole. "Out with it. Let's see if you can ruffle the feathers of your man, shall we?" Well, Nellie fell off her tractor when she was ploughing. She bumped into some old tree fall and went flying over the tractor, landing in its path. The tractor was about to roll over her, but this humanoid hairy creature rescued her. It even disengaged the tractor and literally pushed the whole thing over. Imagine how strong you have to be to do that. "I've seen one of those hairy creatures," my grandfather said, "on this very farm when I was a young boy." "So you believe Nellie's story?" "Without a doubt." He pushed his food away and pulled out his pipe and began to smoke. "I grew up on this farm as a young boy. I've seen things I can't explain. But one day when I was about 8 years old, I remember seeing this tall, shadowy silhouette walking in the creek. It was so big, on closer inspection I realized I was seeing a giant hairy man. This thing was ginormous. He was literally diving under the water, using his bare hands to catch a fish. I was watching him enthralled from behind a tree. I remember thinking that I'd tried that stunt before, on many occasions. There is no way that a giant could catch a fish with his bare hands. Why do you think we have bait, nets, fishing rods, even spears? Because fish are not that easy to catch, that's why. I was astounded because this hairy giant was so fast he grabbed a large fish from under the water. It was thrashing around in his hands. He whacked the wiggling fish against his chest, and it stopped moving. And then he paddled to the edge of the creek and sat on his haunches on the ground and began to tear the fish apart in his hands and to eat it raw. I was so stunned, I quickly went back to call my brothers to show them what I'd seen. But by the time I returned to the creek, the hairy man had all but vanished. So my brothers thought I was making it all up. But I knew what I'd seen. I remember for weeks afterwards trying desperately to catch a fish under the water with my bare hands like he had done. But I couldn't. I even made a spear. But I didn't succeed. So in the end I had to resort to fishing with a rod. I never forgot that hairy man, or the way he caught that fish.
So these hairy men are real? My grandmother asked.
They are real, my grandfather confirmed.
I'd forgotten all about this when I moved into the cottage on my grandparents' farm. I was able to work from home and only needed to pop into Charleston twice a week. It had been about 8 years since my melanoma scare. I'd long since forgotten about it and moved on with my life. One morning in early spring I was awoken to my alarm clock trilling away noisily. I slammed the pillow over my ear to block out the sound, but the damage had been done. I was wide awake. I audibly groaned as I saw the huge pile of paperwork I had to get through with the note in red reminding me of the looming deadline. I've always been a bit of a procrastinator, so the idea of doing all that work made me feel nauseously sick. I made myself a cup of coffee, hoping that the caffeine in my system would somehow energize me, but no such luck. The paperwork on the desk looked about as appealing as a plate of chopped liver first thing in the morning. It had been a long drawn-out winter, although here in West Virginia we don't take the same kind of beating for our winters as people in other states invariably do. I was marvelling at that twinkling sunshine glittering over the silvery pond. When I glanced out at the breathtaking view, and then at my paperwork, I just felt the tugging prickles of an overwhelming longing to go out into nature. I persuaded myself that I wouldn't be long. A quick walk in the fresh air would give me that va-va-voom that I needed to get back to my work when I returned, as right now I felt as uninspired as a snail might feel on a frozen lettuce leaf. But after my walk, I would be rearing to go. Well, that's what I told myself anyway. I threw on a cotton top and a loose pair of cotton pants, and then off I went. I ebulliently bobbed out of the cottage with a feisty zealousness, the cool wind blowing against my face, my cheeks burning from its sweeping coolness. A smile emerged from my lips like the blossom from a closed bud as I entered the wooded sanctuary. It was so peaceful, so tranquil, as the shafts of warm spring sunshine darted hungrily through the trees, enveloping the woodland space in a soft ethereal light. The branches of the tree boughs swinging gently in the winds, many of their boughs heavily laden with a plethora of pretty springtime blossoms. The viridescent green floor sparkled like an emerald jewel, shimmering from the moist fragrant dew that powdered the ferns, the moss and the pretty spring shrubs in a fine wet spray, so that everything glittered, twinkled and sparkled in the soft light of the morning, as if every leaf and flower had been perfectly polished. I realized it must be earlier than I imagined. Perhaps my alarm clock had gone off prematurely, but it was so perfect being up this expeditiously in the morning. The songs of the dawn chorus burst through the woodland sanctuary, the pretty trills and warbles of the birds, such pleasing music to my ears, while the smells of wildflowers lingered in the air like a pretty bouquet. I moved through the woodland space, suddenly realizing I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes boring into my back. I turned around, studying the area where I was standing, but saw nothing there. Silly me, I told myself, as I moved forward into the forest. But with every single step, something else appeared to be following me. I turned around, stopping dead in my track. "Who's there?" I called. "Who's there?" But the echo of my own voice kept returning to me. It was then that through the veil of the green undergrowth and thin saplings that I saw a dark silhouette, and through the leaves a pair of brown eyes appeared to be studying me. They looked like liquid pools of warm treacle. There was nothing cold or aggressive about those eyes, but at 8 feet off the ground this thing was hugely intimidating, so my level of comfort was expunged from me. I turned around to make hasty tracks back to the house, as whatever this was that was watching me from the shadows, it was enormous. I turned around as a little pebble was flung at my back.
I realized this creature was following me. I sensed its energy was playful, almost mischievous, but I wanted to get out of the forest as fast as I could, as my anxiety had escalated. The next thing I knew, that was in my desperate attempts to leave the woods, I had stumbled ungracefully and fallen over a knotted root in the earthen floor. I could hear running feet pounding the ground as they hurried towards me. It seemed like the ground was vibrating, heaving and shaking as the creature neared its approach. I was trying desperately to raise myself off the ground when the benevolent creature that had been following me glided through the shadows like a ghost and was mindfully hovering over me as earnest golden eyes studied me from 8 foot off the ground, wearing an expression of bewilderment on its leathery human-like face. I imagine I must have appeared like a lumbering, clumsy, cloddish idiot to this anomalous creature. I was astonished when he helped me off the ground by reaching out his hand to me. I took it. It was warm, slightly damp, incredibly strong. I could feel the power in those fingers. I thought I had to be dreaming. I was lifted up the ground with a gentle tug. The creature did something very strange with his hand. He moved the skin at the back of my arm towards the front. His flat aquatic nose began to sniff the area. He took several sniffs and began to grunt. He looked up at me and pointed to the spot on my arm, as if he was seeing something bad there. The way he was wrinkling his nose told me that he wasn't pleased by what he had found. I lifted my arm up to examine the area that the creature had been pointing at, and there on my skin was another ominous mole, like the one that a German tourist had spotted on me years before on Venice Beach. But now a strange, outlandish creature had sensed something was wrong with the mole on the back of my arm, and had alerted me to the problem. Maybe he had noticed it when he was following me in the woods, after he had raised me to my feet. All of a sudden a shrill whistle permeated the forest. The creature immediately responded to the sound with a similar whistle back. I knew that sound so well. I thought it was from the birds, but I realized now differently. He looked at me and gave me a firm nod. He glided away. So there I was again, sitting at the doctor's office being asked why I had left it so long, as of course the mole at the back of my arm had been identified as another malignant melanoma. But once again it was stage 3 cancer. It hadn't spread to my lymph nodes. I was very lucky indeed, and declared cancer-free. The trouble was both my moles were in inconspicuous places that I would never have spotted myself if it hadn't been for a random tourist who happened to be a dermatologist and an outlandish creature I now know to be a Bigfoot. I marvel that a creature like that would know that there was something wrong with that mole, which it smelt with its nose. But then dogs can also smell cancer, so maybe it's not so strange after all. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. How many? I asked excitedly. Oh, there's 6 puppies. I'm looking at them right now. They're so adorable. Wilhelmina looks as proud as Punch. Oh, there's one more. It's coming out right now. I see the sack. She's tearing it open, eating it up. She's licking the puppy clean with her tongue. Oh, they're so cute. They're wiggling around, looking for Wilhelmina's teats. So there's 7 puppies. That's incredible. What colour are they? They're creamy, just like Wilhelmina. That means that Mrs. Phillips' golden retriever must be the father. She never got him neutered, you know. So they're all golden retriever puppies. That's amazing. An unlikely accident. That's what I'm thinking. Oh, please can't you come over now to see them? I really want you to. They're so beautiful. I glanced at the clock. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm in my bedroom doing my homework. I promised I'd work until 6 o'clock. Can't you creep out of the window, Julia? Your mother will never know. You can pop over for 15 minutes. She'll never know you're missing. Please come now. All right, I'll see you in a tick, but I can't be long or my mother will kill me. I knew I shouldn't be sneaking out of our ranch-style farmhouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but I was eager to see Wilhelmina's puppies. I knew if I was very quick about it, my parents would be none the wiser. I squeezed out of my bedroom window and dashed towards the shed where I retrieved my bicycle. In seconds I was cycling down the country road towards my best friend's farmhouse. I had no regret seeing Wilhelmina and her 7 beautiful puppies, as it had been so exciting, as the golden retriever looked as proud as Punch about her 7 little younglings, and I was in total awe of these beautiful puppies, so much so that I'd completely lost track of time. I could see that the sun was setting. Before long, the dark shadows of early twilight would infuse the sky with an inky blackness, so I needed to make tracks home as quickly as possible. I didn't fancy riding home in the dark. If my parents found out I was missing from my bedroom and was guilty of failing to do my homework, they would not be best pleased with me. I could find myself being grounded for a week or more. I climbed onto my bicycle, cycling hurriedly down the road, pedalling as fast as I possibly could, as tormenting, inauspicious pictures of my mother's peaked face whirled around in my head, ominous visions of her reprimanding me. My mother could be as tough as old boots when she got mad about something. The last thing I wanted was to be on the receiving end of her wrath. My father could be very forgiving, but my mother was like a dog with a bone when her feathers got ruffled. You could rest assured that if you did something wrong, you would constantly be reminded of your iniquity for weeks to come. I was ever grateful that there were street lights on the asphalt road, so at least I could see more clearly. It had grown dark, as if someone had turned the dimmer switch to low. It seemed like only moments before the tangerine orange sunset had dappled everything in a golden glaze. But now things had become menacing, foreboding. I could see the baleful, shadowy silhouettes of the red maple and red budwood trees on either side of the embankment, swaggering minaciously in the breeze. Even these gentle giants had taken on a sinister, portentous pose. I felt as if I was being watched by pernicious eyes that drilled through my back like jagged knives. I felt instinctively that something was very wrong, as even the crickets and frogs had not started to sing yet. My gaze was fixated on the trees. I could swear I could see foreboding, airy shadows creeping in the looming darkness, and hear sinister whispers calling my name provocatively in the wind. Julia, Julia, Julia. Was I imagining this, I wondered? My parents, like many West Virginian elders, did not like us being out in the darkness, as stories abounded of myths, fables, legends, and bizarre accounts of peculiar beings that haunted the woods at the dead of night. But up until now, I had never given those thoughts a moment's credence. I thought the stories were made up by well-meaning adults who wanted to be certain that their children would not go exploring the woods at night. In a trice I saw something obscure but tall and dark standing in the middle of the road. But as I neared my approach, I saw it clearly. It was a direful-looking creature, easily over 6 foot tall. It looked like a human, covered in thick, short, cropped hair, but with a dog-like muzzle and full feathered tail, while the hands on this thing had acute, razor-sharp talons that were so serrated they could tear you limb from limb, easily searing flesh as seamlessly as a butcher's roast. In that moment the adrenaline coursed through my veins as the creature glared at me through these antagonistic, malevolent, baleful red eyes. It growled at me so fiercely that I nearly fell off my bike. I thought I was staring into the eyes of the devil himself, or one of his helpers that stokes up the flames of hell. For a second I wondered if I was actually seeing a demon. I knew I had to get away as fast as I possibly could, because this thing, whatever in God's name it was, wanted my blood. Of that I was in no doubt, for the eldritch look it gave me was a threatening kind of hungry, predatory look that was just so horrifying. My heart was thumping so violently. I was losing my balance on my bike as the fear that coursed through my veins undermined my good judgment. I quickly turned around in the middle of the road to ride back towards my friend's house. I couldn't ride past this gruesome creature. There was no way I could. But I could hear it running after me. It grabbed my bike, began to shake it hard. While I began to scream, my breathing quickened, my fear escalated, seizing my entire body with a terror that heightened my ability to ride my bicycle even faster. But the creature was holding my bike down so hard that I was pedalling away as if I was on a stationary bike. Then I heard the unwelcome purr of an engine, but the truck never stopped. I remember going, "No! Please, no!" After that my memory goes blank. But I was to learn from Mrs. Rolfe, who was driving down the road at the time of the collision, that she was tapping a message in her cell phone to her husband Lucas. "I'm on my way now. I'll be home in 10 minutes. For a moment her attention was diverted off the road. A moment was all it took. That's all it ever takes, a second of distraction. Then your life can be changed forever. She then heard the awful screeching sound. She realised she'd run over something in the road, something very substantial. She'd heard the metal of a bike being gnarled, folded, buckled and pulverised by her own vehicle. Mrs. Ralph's pulse began to race at 100 miles an hour as she slammed down her brake as hard as she could with her foot. She climbed hurriedly out of her truck. Her heart was filled with trepidation and terror as she inspected the dreadful carnage. She gasped in horror. She found my body lying in a crumpled heap in the middle of the road, my eyes staring vacantly into space like a dead fish, my body as floppy and unflinching as a rag doll, my skin the colour of death, my disfigured bicycle a mangled wreck. She let out a terrified scream. "Oh, my God! Please, no! This can't be happening!" She ran towards me, shaking my body as vigorously as she could, hoping against all hope that she could wake me out of my enforced slumber. But my body just flopped lifelessly. My legs and arms dangled, drooping in strange angles. Mrs. Rolfe was gripped by feelings of overwhelming dread, while a shameful guilt stabbed at her gut. "I should have been watching the road," she told herself angrily. "I'm a bloody idiot. Look what I've done. Tonight I've destroyed lives, starting with my very own. I can live with what I've done to myself, but not what I've done to an innocent family. I can never forgive myself for this," she thought. Julia, it's me. It's Mrs. Ralph. Are you all right, Julia?" Blood was pouring out of my mouth. My eyes rolled in the back of my head. She checked for a pulse. She could hear a low murmur. Frantically, Mrs. Rolfe grabbed her phone, calling the ambulance. "Come at once. I've run over a girl in the middle of the road. The girl's name is Julia Clarkson. Yes, I can feel a pulse, but I'm scared. I think she's fading. She might die." "Calm down, madam. We're on our way. Please stay with the young girl." Mrs. Ralph had to be sedated when the ambulance arrived, as she had become a bag of nerves. "It's all my fault," she was crying. "I should have been paying attention to the road. Look what I've done." I was placed on a gurney and taken to the hospital by ambulance, but I remember nothing of that journey. Robert's account. It must have been about 6:15 when we could hear ambulance sirens in the distance. Even my mother wondered if someone had been in an accident. Oh dear, she reflected. Whoever they are, I do hope they're all right, and I hope it's not someone we know. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang to our home. It was unusual to have guests visiting our home this late in the evening, so I went to see who it was. My mother had answered the door. She was talking to a police officer. The blue warning lights on his vehicle were flashing in our driveway, alerting me to the fact that this was not a social visit by any manner of means. Something bad must have happened. I could hear the soft, urgent murmur of voices. The tone of the officer's solicitous voice was beleaguered and serious. His face looked exceedingly grave. His disheartened demeanour was very troubled. Something bad had happened, but who to, I wondered. "You must have it wrong," my mother insisted. "Julia's in her bedroom doing her homework." "Sorry, ma'am, but it's definitely your daughter, Julia. She was knocked down by a car this evening. She's in hospital. Mrs. Ralph ran her over. She knows your daughter very well. She says it was definitely Julia. I'm afraid your daughter was not very responsive. It looks very serious. The injuries are very, very bad. I'm sorry, ma'am, to be the bearer of such bad news." My mother's face grew as white as a sheet, her eyes round with horror. She oscillated her arms above her head and let out a shrill scream. "My baby! My baby! Is she going to be all right?" "Calm down, madam," said the sheriff. "Your daughter is in the very good hands at the hospital. They're doing everything they can for her." "My baby! My baby!" cried my mother, the tears pouring down her face. I must go to her now." "We will take you to the hospital now, ma'am," he said, escorting her out of the house. We were to learn that my sister had sneaked out of the house when she was supposed to be doing her homework to see the neighbours' new puppies, but she'd been knocked over by a car in the road when the driver, Mrs. Rolfe, had been momentarily distracted while she was texting her husband Lucas and failed to see Julia cycling in the road. But the odd thing about the account, that my sister was seen cycling towards her friend's farm when she'd been there only moments before, rather than cycling back towards home. We were to discover that my sister was in a coma, and she'd undergone multiple surgeries. No one was any the wiser whether she would make a full recovery or not, so both my parents were completely devastated. Over the next few weeks while Julia was in hospital, my parents visited her regularly. I began to feel terribly alone. There was no structure in my life anymore. No relegated homework, no scheduled meal times. Everything in our lives had been turned upside down, topsy-turvy, inside out. My mother would spend countless hours at the hospital visiting Julia, but when she was at home she would pace around our house like a wildcat in a zoo enclosure, with her thoughts focused entirely upon Julia. Sometimes she barely noticed I was even there. She would stand there biting her nails nervously, staring vacantly into space, while my overwrought father wore a wounded, flustered expression on his face that was perpetually grim, as if he was carrying the weight of the world upon his shoulders. Ostensibly, the sorrowful, crushing energy in our home was like a soupy, torrid, humid atmosphere, birthed not by austere, unkind weather conditions outside our home, but the suffocating, muggy energy of our senseless despair and hopelessness that made the climate within our home oppressive, abrasive, and insufferable. "We're going to have to pull our weight as a family. We need to be strong for Julia," my father would tell us, but it was easier said than done. People had been so kind. Well-wishers had sent us flowers and brought us home-cooked meals. I had personally visited my sister in hospital on a few occasions, but I didn't recognize her. It would seem her little body was covered in bandages and plasters, while she had tubes coming out of her mouth, heart monitors connected to her, along with all kinds of strange machines and devices. It was hard to even believe that this broken person in the hospital bed was actually Julia. It looked nothing like her. I could see by the morbid expressions on the doctors' faces that things had not improved. My sister's health was rapidly declining. The fear that my sister might never wake up hung over our head like an ever-present threat. They were the unarticulated words that no one ever dared to broach. No one ever said, "What if?" as the very thought that Julia might not be coming home was too incomprehensible for us to even fathom. I began to feel very isolated, lonely, and forsaken in my home, as my parents were never there for me. The compounding grief that my sister was now in a coma had hit my family so hard. It was as if every person in my household had been run over by a forklift truck and had been emotionally decimated, as if every part of us had been squashed into that asphalt road when my sister had that accident. My parents became disconnected, disengaged, and almost divorced from their own lives. They were functioning on autopilot, so that everything was almost done robotically, like the washing, the cleaning, and the shopping. My mother had become such a jittering bag of nerves that she'd been highly sedated by the doctor, who put her on some calming medication that made her become almost zombie-like. I knew I couldn't stand being in the house, so I began to spend a long period of time out in the woods. It offered me the perfect sanctuary and peace that I craved. It was an escapism from the chaotic environment of our broken lives that were as mangled and dishevelled as my sister lying in that hospital bed. My family lived in West Virginia, between the scenic views of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Ohio River. We lived in a beautiful ranch-style home nestled in a pretty valley. Wherever you looked you would see trees, and yet more trees, the undulating curls of the mountains, and an endless expanse of perfect blue sky, where birds would often soar into the heavens, the most spectacular being the bald eagle. I'd even seen them dropping their young in the sky from time to time, and lifting them up again until the young eagles finally learnt how to fly. It was always breathtaking to watch them. It was on a Saturday morning that I arose early and prepared myself a picnic lunch. I was determined to escape the depressing melancholia that cloaked our home in a heaviness that was so tangible. I decided to take a little backpack with some lunchtime snacks to the woodgrove to spend the afternoon there. I tried to tell my incoherent mother about it, but as usual she seemed preoccupied. "I wonder how Julia's doing," she kept rambling on to herself in unintelligible mumbles as she stared vacantly out of the window. her mind 1,000 miles away. "Mum," I said. "Yes, dear," was her vacant response. "I'm going to the woods. I'm taking my lunch there." "Yes, dear," she said. In truth, I don't think she had even assimilated a single word I'd said. Both my dithery parents were beginning to annoy me. As they were so caught up in limbo, they were not even living their normal lives. My mother formerly had been a slightly overweight woman, with a round, heart-shaped face, who dressed in bright, cheerful colours, was effusive and positive. She was now a zombie. Since Julia's accident, she'd stopped eating, dropped several dress sizes, and become so skinny. She looked like a walking skeleton, her skin ghostly pale, her blue eyes almost faded, her hair tousled and unkempt, while my father had packed on the pounds, as he was always eating to suppress his emotions, or sloshing down copious amounts of beer to drown his sorrows. He would sit in front of the television drinking 6 packs of beer, sometimes getting inebriated. My grandmother had tried to knock some sense into my mother when she had stayed the weekend with us. She had chastised her own daughter. "Claudia, I know Julia's in the hospital, and yes, it is terrible what happened to her. But you need to get a grip, dear. You have a son that is anxious for your love. You are willfully ignoring him. Worse still, you're letting your own health slide. Look at you. You've lost so much weight. The way you're going, you'll make a catwalk model look fat. You need to start eating, dear." Of course, like everything else, my grandmother's warning words were like water off a duck's back, as my mother refused to listen, but continued to be cocooned in her own tortured world, where all her attention was focused on Julia. She hung on to every word the doctors would tell her, as if she was dangling on a cliff face, too terrified to let go in case she fell. I knew if I slipped out of the house, my parents wouldn't even know I was missing. Our home had become like a living morgue. It was as if my parents were living in a parallel universe. I said goodbye to my mother, who was sitting on the green and gold-upholstered couch in our living room, staring at a picture of my sister. "Mum," I repeated, "as I've told you 5,000 times already, I'm going now." "Yes, dear," was her response. I suppose I'd been secretly hoping for some kind of reaction, but none was forthcoming. She didn't seem to care what I was up to or where I was going, which was very upsetting. Never for a moment did she glance up at me. It was like she was a waxwork statue at Madame Tussauds, rigidly fixed on the photograph that she was looking at. But she was almost staring through the photograph, as if her eyes were actually made of glass. I could see my father mowing the turf in the backyard. He was wearing his blue jeans and plaid shirt, but like my mother, he was caught up in his own thoughts. I waved at him, but he barely acknowledged me. It left me feeling so unimportant, and as if I wasn't nearly as precious to them as my sister. I was beginning to resent her for consuming so much of my parents' time. I think I was actually jealous of her in some kind of warped way, as she was getting their undivided attention. Gone were the days when my mother asked me if I'd done my homework, or when she told me I had to be in bed by 10 o'clock, or when I was told to eat all my cabbage, or I wouldn't get dessert. Now I could leave all my food and just eat dessert, and my parents wouldn't even bat an eyelid. All the boundaries that had been placed around my life, that I'd always despised, had been lifted. My parents didn't care any more about anything now that Julia was in a coma. It was as if the safety and security of our home had come crashing down. I craved those parental boundaries more than ever. I longed for my mother to tell me to eat the food on my plate. I longed for her to relegate me to my bedroom for a couple of hours to complete my homework. Those things would have made me feel loved and noticed, for I began to feel lonely and isolated in my home, with parents who were never present and were as inspiring as the white paint on the exterior walls of our home. I reluctantly climbed on my bike and cycled down the long ribbon of asphalt to the wood grove that was situated on the edge of an old logging road. It wasn't too far from our home. I loved it there. It was early spring, spectacularly beautiful, as the dogwood trees were in blossom, their boughs covered in delicate spring blooms, along with the serviceberries, eastern budwoods and tulip trees. Soft shafts of twinkling sunlight cascaded through the branches of the trees, dappling the forest floor in a shimmering ethereal light. I placed my bicycle against a red maple tree, venturing into the heart of the woods, where the voluptuous trunks of the trees penciled up into the sky like statuesque verdant giants, their vast boughs creating a fabulous canopy over my head. My cushioned rubber soles pressed the soft earthen floor beneath my feet. where pretty lacy ferns were scattered liberally across the floor, and green moss carpeted fallen tree branches. Yellow daffodils and bluebells gathered together in cheerful little clusters. A little red fox with a full bushy tail stopped for a second to watch me, and then it scampered off, while a couple of squirrels eyed me curiously through inquisitive brown eyes before they scuttled up the branches. I could hear the pretty sounds of the birds, the warbles, tweets and chirrups, as well as the crashing sound of the white water thundering over the rocks in the pretty stream that meandered through the woods. I happened to look up in the branches of a Herculean-sized tree, which had the most superb solid structure, where at one time an old dilapidated treehouse had stood. No one knew who had built the treehouse, as it had been there for a very long time, but over the years it had fallen apart, although the structure and base were still pretty solid. I was surprised to see that someone had put it together again in a haphazard way that wasn't aesthetically pleasing, but somehow it worked. They had weaved branches, grasses and saplings into the structure. It was very crude and rudimentary, but I was curious and assumed some kids had created this little hideout. Naturally, I was intrigued, so I climbed up the tree to examine it closely and to investigate the structure better. I was pleased with what I found. It really was quite cosy up there. It smelt a little musty, but that didn't put me off in any way. The original treehouse floor was still in place, and there was a wide door-like opening that overlooked the stream, and the view over the water was absolutely magnificent. I sat down to enjoy the panoramic view and decided to eat my sandwiches up in this sheltered space. I opened up my plastic container and pulled out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and took a bite. It tasted delicious, as everything eaten outdoors invariably does. I also took a big swig of orange juice from my thermos flask. It was peaceful up in the treehouse. I could see long ribbons of moving water cascading over the rocks, which was so hypnotic that I found myself shutting my eyes for a moment and beginning to drift off to sleep. How long I was out for I don't know, but I was lying on the treehouse floor in a curled heap. All of a sudden I woke up to hear a creaking sound. Someone was climbing up the tree. I began to panic as a hefty silhouette manoeuvred itself up the tree trunk until it was hovering over me. Then I saw it. Nothing prepared me for what I was witnessing. It was a surprise to see me, as I was to see it. This thing was a monster. There is no other way to describe it. It was, quite literally, the most terrifying creature I have ever beheld. A creature that belongs to the realms of fairy tales or gruesome legends, but not in our reality. I was so startled by what I was seeing that I rubbed my eyes a couple of times to ensure I wasn't dreaming. But this was no dream. This was my worst nightmare come to fruition. The creature looked human, in its body shape and silhouette, but it possessed the muzzle, tail and claws of a dog, but it stood on 2 feet like a man. I sat up from my sleeping position with eyes as wide as saucers and a mouth hanging open with astonishment. I could feel my entire body trembling. The creature glared at me with treacherous red eyes that depicted such a malevolent hatred towards me. I realized that this little treehouse was its den, and he wasn't happy with me for making myself at home in his nest. I watched in horror as it lifted back its thin black lips to reveal those sharp, ghastly canine teeth, while it let out the most terrifying roar. I began to scream. I literally bolted down the wrong side of the tree to escape its grasp. But this hideous, repugnant thing was after me. I could hear its heavy breathing, grunting, and occasional snarl. I knew I was in trouble. Big, big trouble. My heart was thundering violently in my chest, while my life flashed before my eyes. I was certain I was about to die. I lost my footing, stumbling down the tree. I fell with an almighty thud. I landed on the ground at an unfortunate angle. I could feel my ankle throbbing as waves of pain shot through my foot. I tried to get up, stumbling on all fours, raising myself to my feet. I began to hobble awkwardly. The pain was excruciating. There was no way I could get away from this beast. All of a sudden, large clawed hands grabbed me by the arm, throwing me to the ground with a powerful force. The creature pounced on top of me, crushing my body beneath his weight. I could hear his heart beating against my body, smell his vile, hot breath. It smelt like rotten meat. He blew hot air on my neck. I was terrified. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could. I did try to fight back, wiggling my body beneath his, but he held me down with such a powerful brute force that I couldn't even move a muscle. The next thing I knew was this creature was licking my neck with his huge, hot, wet tongue. It was drooling over me as its spittle began dribbling all over my face. Then something quite extraordinary happened. A thunderous booming sound could be heard bounding through the forest. It sounded like hundreds of bison were running towards us, kicking up the ground with their hooves as the forest seemed to heave and groan. It was unlike any sound I've ever heard before. The sound came to a sudden stop, and then I heard the most frightful roar. The creature that had been crushing me under his weight jumped to his feet. He reacted adversely to that roar. I opened my eyes to see fear in his eyes. He let out a strange, anguished cry. He began to hightail it out of the forest as fast as he could, clearly rattled by what was approaching us. And that was when I saw it. Standing in between two red maple trees, looking directly at me, through deep-set dark eyes, was a Bigfoot. I should have been terrified, but the Bigfoot's eyes were so incredibly kind, as it regarded me with such a sincere, genuine look, as though it was worried about my welfare. It seemed protective towards me. At the time I didn't know what it was, but it stood up on two legs at about 8 foot tall and 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. It was covered in long flowing golden brown hair, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head, and a face that was so remarkably human. It gestured for me to get up, and escorted me through the forest, walking about 3 feet behind me all the time. I kept hearing it saying in my mind, "I've got your back. You're going to be all right." I was hobbling badly, but gradually my ankle seemed to improve. Luckily it wasn't badly sprained, nor was it broken. I found my bicycle, and the creature continued to follow me until I turned down the driveway that led to my own home, and then he glided away and was gone from my sight. I never saw him again, but I know that Bigfoot saved me from a very dangerous predator that I knew was about to kill me. Of that I am in no doubt. To cut a long story short, my sister came out of a coma after 3 months. Her memory came flooding back shortly afterwards. Me and my sister both compared notes, and are absolutely convinced that the dog-like creature that chased after her that day was the same one that tried to attack me in the woods when I took refuge in its nest. We never shared our stories with our parents to avoid upsetting them further. It would seem that both of my parents didn't fare well from my sister's drawn-out coma, but finally, after a little counselling, they bounced back. They became the loving parents we once knew. I was so grateful now for the boundaries and rules. It meant my parents were paying attention to me again. My sister made a full recovery from her accident and was given a golden retriever from our neighbour as a gift. We called her Chancer, as my sister said she'd been given a second chance at life. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night. My story tonight, the first one, it comes to us from Wayne. He says here, "Dear Sarah, my name is Wayne and I'm involved in wildlife conservation and rescue. It was in the early 80s that I was notified by the authorities about an escaped domesticated tiger that had been seen around the area and was causing all kinds of problems for the locals, who were very frightened about this animal. In my experience, domesticated tigers do tend to gravitate towards human beings because they tend to associate humans with easy food and play, because that's what they've always known. That's why a creature that is normally very elusive in the wild was seen by so many of the locals at the time, and they were terrified of this wild tiger harming or killing any of their children or pets. Farmers were also worried about the fate of their livestock, and so people were extremely concerned about their own personal safety. I was asked to track down this tiger and return it to the owners, because this was beyond being a police matter. The owners were absolutely devastated about their missing Bengal tiger, whom they called Molly, and they adored her. All the family interacted with the creature, and they said that she was very tame, that she would lie on the carpet next to the family when they watched television at night, and would go swimming in the pool with their teenager boy.
They regarded the tiger as a member of the family that was really well loved and precious, and assured me that as long as the creature was respected, it would remain docile and affectionate. In my experience, a wild animal cannot be fully domesticated because there's always the potential of that wild, ingrained natural instinct that, if provoked unintentionally, could cause the creature to lash out and cause all kinds of damage. Worse still, if the creature was hungry, he could potentially be very, very dangerous. I cannot tell you where this happened for reasons of confidentiality in this matter. I will tell you that it was an area that was remote and rural, with thousands of square acres of natural forest, which is ideal for a tiger because they need lots of space. Ironically, these vast areas of North American wilderness were perfect for a large cat like a tiger, but not so ideal for someone tracking the creature because it could have been almost anywhere. For me, the first port of call was to go and speak to the people who had had recent sightings of the creature. The one thing I knew was that it would gravitate toward human beings, and this gave me the strong hope that we would be able to recapture the creature quite quickly. I went to visit all the locals in the area who had seen sightings of the tiger, and so I began to get a brief idea of whereabouts the creature might be. I had been tracking animals for years, so I knew exactly what to look out for. One family who contacted me said that they had not physically seen the tiger, but had seen the brush moving in the wooded area of their land, and that they had heard the sounds of huge, massive animals scouting around that had been growling at them and letting out the most aggressive and vicious roars. I decided to search the area, despite the fact that it was much further off the beaten path than the other sightings. Armed with a rifle that I always carried for my own personal protection, I navigated the forest in the way that any tracker would. Your senses have to be sensitive about everything around you so that you can observe everything as carefully as you can. What I saw left me with more questions than answers. Before I go into my story, I just want to stress that I had never ever heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch before at the time. Remember, it was in the 80s and the hairy man had not had the exposure that he's had now. In those days, most of our information was gleaned from libraries and encyclopedias, so we did not have the knowledge so heartily available today or accessible on our World Wide Web. It was not that I was not open to the idea of such cryptic creatures existing, but it was not something that I'd ever considered or conceived of before. In truth, there are so many areas of North American wilderness that have not been explored by man, so it wouldn't be surprising at all if creatures we do not know about could exist in some of those remote areas. Nothing would surprise me. The first thing I noticed as I started studying the ground, which was fortunately quite muddy from early rainfall during the week, was that there were no tiger trail markers anywhere. I could see signs of turkey, deer, rabbits, and all kinds of other creatures, and I observed all their scat in the area, which also gave me an indication of the kind of animals that had been passing through. But there definitely had been no sighting of a tiger. Suddenly I came across a muddy area that was when I stood still, barely being able to believe what I was seeing. It was a humanoid footprint in the mud that was 16 inches long and 12 feet wide, but it was clearly not from a human or even a bear. I got a good view of the big toe area, and I could see it was too splayed out to be a human's, because humans are a lot straighter because they wear shoes, and whatever this creature was, it had never known a pair of shoes in its life. I could barely believe what I was seeing, but I shrugged it off as my intention was to find the tiger markers that I was not seeing here. I was satisfied that there were no tiger trails in the area, and that people had been mistaken about the predator that they thought they had heard, as there was nothing here. Suddenly I noticed everything around me went very quiet and exceedingly still. Birds were no longer chirping, and there were no other sounds. When that happens, I know as a tracker from personal experience, it usually means that a predator is around. I stood very still for a moment in deep contemplation, and then I heard the sound of something very hefty and heavy walking through the brush. But whatever this thing was, I knew it was bipedal. It was walking on 2 legs and definitely not 4. In that moment, I knew something was there. and I've experienced this gut feeling before many times as a tracker, knowing when a dangerous predator is about. It's almost like a sixth sense of just knowing instinctively, and it's inbuilt, and it's for humans to warn them of danger, and it should never be ignored. I could sense that something was watching me, and whatever it was too close for comfort, and not being able to see it was extremely unnerving because it puts you in a position of exceeding vulnerability. Predators use this tool to take advantage of their prey. I could even smell the creature, and the smell was the most unpleasant smell that I have ever smelt in my entire life. In fact, it was so revolting that I went over to the bush to throw up. Was this smell another tool, I wondered, that the creature was using to intimidate its prey, or was it just its natural body odour? As I was speculating about all of this, I suddenly heard the most awful roar, and it was not the sound of a tiger, but something that sounded even more treacherous and deadly. I promise you that my whole body almost shut down. This creature had impacted my natural human reaction by impairing my responses. I just stood there, frozen to the spot, barely being able to breathe or move. It was like my legs had grown several tons of weight in a second, and it was difficult to maneuver my body at all. No creature before has ever incapacitated me like this. No lion, no tiger, no bear. And the effects it had on me were so destabilizing. I did not know in the world what to do. But for me, this effect literally bordered on the supernatural. And to this day, I have no rational explanation for my reaction to this creature. No other predator I have ever worked with in my entire life has affected me so profoundly, both emotionally and physically. Then I saw it rushing through the thicket at me with a mock charge. I knew it was a mock charge because I'm experienced at that kind of thing. This is common behavior in the ape species, and it's designed purposely to intimidate. I could see the creature was asserting its authority towards me and making it very clear who was boss. He was behaving this way because this was his territory. I could not believe what I was seeing because I've never seen an animal like this before. You could be forgiven for believing that this was a man dressed in a ghillie suit, but it was way too big to be a human. It was about 7 feet in height and easily 550 pounds. I would say the girth of this chest was 3.5 feet wide. The creature looked as if he did indeed possess both primate and human DNA. It had a very long, elongated skull, like many of the ancient skulls that have been recovered in the past of what some believe belonged to the Nephilim. I would not be surprised if those were the skulls from these Bigfoot creatures. It is a conical head. Its conical head sat on massive shoulders, and it had a long, hairless face with a very distinctive brow ridge and big brown eyes with a very flat nose. It also had very long arms that are a distinctive attribute of the ape species, and I knew this was the creature who had made those large footprints in the mud. There was no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. As I stood there, I became as submissive as I could. That's what I would do if I was standing in front of a great ape. I did not challenge him, nor did I raise my rifle in his direction. Believe me, this creature was exceedingly intelligent, and he would know what my rifle was. And the last thing I wanted to do was to accelerate his anger and make him even more impulsive and reactive that could potentially be fatal for me. I appealed to the humanness in this creature, which is there, believe it or not, buried beneath all those layers of angry, volatile reactions. And especially in this creature who was, in no doubt, an alpha male. I diverted my eyes from the creature and played a very submissive role as possible, which is what I would have done if an ape were threatening me. I walked backwards slowly, facing the creature, but looking downwards, and I do believe he calmed down almost immediately. He grunted to himself and chattered away, as if he was finally satisfied that I imposed no threat, and that I wasn't going to be staying for long, and then he just walked away just like that. As you can imagine, I could not believe what I had witnessed, and I do not know what the creature was. I had heard of the abominable snowman before, and that is what I thought this creature must be, until years later I was to discover it was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. Some might even call him the abominable snowman anyway. In my profession, there are lots of disbelievers about this creature, so I have not shared my encounter with anyone I know. But when I heard about this anonymous forum, I decided that my secret could come out of its secret box, buried away in the memory files of my mind that have been marked declassified for so long. For many of you animal lovers out there wanting to know what happened to Molly the tiger, well, I'm glad to tell you that we did finally track her down, and I think she was very happy to return to her home, where she was welcomed in with open arms by her loving owners. I would say that as lovely as this domestic tiger is, it still did have the potential to be dangerous. So I hope they survived little Molly, or rather the big tiger. I hope you and your listeners enjoyed my story. The next story is also going to be one that you're really going to love, and so let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Angelica and I'm from Oregon. Some may call that the heart of Bigfoot country. I grew up on a 30-acre plot of land and lived in a very basic, rudimentary cabin with my parents and two of my younger siblings. It was in the early 80s when I had my first Bigfoot encounter. My mother was a stay-at-home housewife who manned the fort while my dad was doing jobs for the Forestry Commission. My mother was born to be a housewife because she loved her life raising us, taking care of the livestock and attending to our every need. As far as she was concerned, family was her world, and she went beyond the call of duty to give us the best lives imaginable, and she succeeded wholeheartedly. In those days, we rarely did live off the land like a proper homestead would. My mother grew us vegetables in the garden, and we would get milk and cream from our dairy cows, eggs from our free-range chickens, honey from our bees, and my father was a great hunter, and so we were well fed with fish from our stocked lake, chickens from our farm, and wild animals that my father killed on our land, which ranged from deer, turkey to rabbits. When my dad was away on a job after some early morning homeschooling at school, my sisters and I would spend our days exploring. My mother always kept her steely eyes on our every movement. The land had been in our family since the early 1800s and was very precious to my father and was something he wanted to keep in our bloodline for generations to come. Sadly, that was not going to happen. I knew no other life than getting up in the morning very early to the early sound of the dawn chorus, and to help my mother with all the household chores, which included feeding the chickens, collecting their eggs, or even hand-milking Matilda, who was my personal favourite cow. Later in the day, I'd help my mother bottle preserves, like strawberry jams and pickles, as well as prepare evening meals, which required relentless peeling of potatoes and chopping of vegetables, you know, the usual arduous stuff. One day we had a very unusual visitor come to our home. I do not know what her connection was to our family, but I believe her long since deceased husband had known my dad when he was a boy. This woman was one of the creepiest people I have ever met in my entire life, and if you had told me she was a witch, I would have 1,000% believed you. I think the thing that freaked me out about her the most were her yellow-brown serpent-like eyes that looked through you almost like a vulture scanning its prey from a great height. I could feel those terrible eyes devouring me with every look, and I just wanted to run and hide. "And so who is this?" said the woman, smiling at me with a toothless grin that set my nerves on edge. Why on earth did she have gums with no teeth? I wondered. Why would you go around just with gums and no teeth? It was so odd. "This is my daughter Angelica," said my mother, smiling and pushing me towards the lady as if half expecting me to give her a hug. The lady reached out to grab me with one of her sinewy, arthritic hands, but I pulled away as fast as I could. I did not want this monstrous woman to touch me. "We have got a troubled little soul here," said the lady, looking at me with a distinct look of disapproval. "Poor little mite, she's got a lot of learning to do." My father came into the room full of beams. You remember your step-uncle Niles, who died 5 years ago, he said to me. Well, this is his wife Trudy, and she's going to be joining us for dinner. Isn't that nice? Yes, I said. I was surprised to see that this strange elderly grey-haired, blue-rinsed lady, with her black bedraggled bohemian-style lacy dress that dangled over her ankles in thin petticoat layers, was having no impact on my younger siblings at all, who seemed oblivious to this woman's blatant peculiarities. The woman reached out for her black wallet-like purse, and I kid you not, pulled out a pair of dentures from a smart silver box and set them back in her mouth before she began to eat. Seeing her do this made my stomach cringe, but my mother pretended not to notice her vulgar behaviour. I mean, surely she could have put her dentures on in the bathroom. All I knew was I wanted to get away from the dinner table as fast as I could. I started playing with my roast turkey and mashed potatoes with my knife and fork like a very bored child. Enough of that, Angelica, my father scolded. Mind your manners, please, and stop playing with your food like that. It's very annoying. Is she always like this, so full of nervous energy? Said the woman. I cannot wait to read her palm. That will tell me a lot about her life purpose. I think you have an interesting one here, she said, speaking with her mouth so full that I could actually see her churning her food like a processor. It was disgusting. I grew cold with disgust. The woman really was a witch, I thought, and I was absolutely terrified of her reading my hand. Supposing she saw me with a crippling, disabling disease, or a terrible sudden accident or disaster in my future. If anything was bad in my future, I would rather not know about it, because knowing for me was far more agonizing than being happily oblivious to what the future had in store for me. I had always been more frightened by what I did not know than by what I could see. My father and mother eagerly presented their palms to the lady. Maybe they did not believe in palm reading anyway, and were just humouring her because she was our guest after all, but they seemed eager to hear what she had to say. The lady looked at my father's hand, and I could see by her dismayed, hesitant expression that something that she was seeing was not at all good. Go on, encouraged my father. Tell me, even if it's not what I want to hear. Am I going to be eaten by a tiger? He teased. The woman was silent, and so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. What? Said my father. I'm really going to be eaten by a tiger? I would not joke about things like that, said the woman, looking mildly irritated by my father's futile attempts at being humorous. I am not sure you will like what I'm going to tell you, she said. Please, my father urged. I do not know if I believe in this stuff anyway, so just tell me for the hell of it. After all, it's only a bit of fun, isn't it? The woman bit her thin, cracked lips, and then paused for a long moment, and then she spoke. Your life will be cut short by a sudden disaster. I see your head. Yes, something to do with your head. I feel a thumping headache coming on. You mean like a brain aneurysm? Asked my father in horror. No, said the lady, looking at my father with heartless brown eyes. No more violent than that. Like someone causing you grievous bodily harm. Is it someone I know? Asked my dad. And how far in the future do you see this happening to me? And is there any way of stopping it? Your lifeline is cut short here, she said, pointing a crooked finger at my father's hand. Your life will come to a violent, sudden end, and it will be soon. And no, it cannot be changed, because it has already been predestined by the choices you made before your incarnation. In other words, you chose your own ending. I saw the look of total horror on my father's gentle face, and his soft blue eyes seemed to cloud over as if he was pushing back tears. I do not believe in all this reincarnation stuff, said my father. I'm a godly man. Good for you, said the lady, looking at my father with an exasperated expression on her face. I'm only telling you what I see, and I have yet to be proved wrong. You see, the hands do not lie. They're a roadmap of our life paths. My mother's face had grown as white as a sheet, and she hastily grabbed the dinner plates from the table and mumbled under her breath, I'm sure it's not true. I'm sure it's not true. I'm sure it's not true. My mother seemed less eager to present her hand to the lady, and I saw that it had become clammy and sweaty, as if she was terrified about what she might hear, but for the sake of our guest, putting up a brave front and acting like she did not believe it all anyway. It was only a bit of fun after all. "Oh, I see a long life here," said the lady. "I see you chose a very easy incarnation for yourself. You clearly are a very young, inexperienced soul. I do see a few health problems along your journey, something to do with your blood pressure, but on the whole, a good long life. But your ticker will finally get the better of you, but not until you're really old." My mother looked relieved and pushed my hand forward. "Your turn, Angelica. Let's see what the future has in store for you." My heart started to race at 1,000 miles an hour. I was utterly terrified, and the fear I felt caused me to bolt out of the house like an unbridled, rebellious horse, and I literally galloped out of that cabin at 100 miles an hour. I felt as if I was running for my life and being pursued by a malicious predator, and I just continued to run and run and run. I could see that the horrible woman in my mind turning into a hideous demonic creature with long wings, hunting me down like a massive hawk and revealing to me the things I just didn't want to know. Bear in mind that my family lived on a large plot. We're talking about a vast acreage of rambling natural vegetation and ubiquitous trees that had not been tended to for years, as my father's job for the Forestry Commission meant that he had left our hand to its own natural devices. It had become a wilderness that over the years had attracted some of the healthiest looking wildlife that you have ever seen. We had huge deer on our land, and I even saw giant turkeys that they were so big they could have been on the Guinness Book of Records. Some of our property was so remarkably overgrown that the only paths you could see were made by the deer, and these pathways were narrow and relatively low. So I was surprised to find some new pathways that were 8 feet wide and 10 feet high, and they were all over the place. It was almost as if my father had decided to clear away some of the dense thicket that was full of nasty thorns and barbs, to clear away for better hunting opportunities. But since when had he had time to do such a thing, I wondered. For a moment, curiosity got the better of me, and I began to forget why I was here in the first place. The sheer terror I had experienced in the presence of that vile woman had finally left me. Even if she had seen a short life for my dad, why had she told him something quite so foreboding and so nonsensical? Why had she been so heartless and so insensitive? The thought of losing my father to a sudden disaster brought tears to my eyes, and I was surprised to find that I really was crying. I could taste the saltiness of my tears. I knew I wasn't supposed to wonder about the wild areas of our land without supervision from an adult, because there are a lot of wild animals here that my father had spotted from time to time, like bobcats, cougars, coyotes, mountain lions, and even a black panther. Yes, I knew I was not 100% safe out here in the wilderness part of our land, but being away from that nasty witch brought a sense of peace and serenity to my being. Come what may, that predator would never get to read my palm, and if it meant spending a week in this rambling undergrowth, well then so be it. It was worth my while. I decided to follow a big path that had been made in the dense undergrowth, and one of them led it to an open clearing with a beautiful stream. It was like I had found a magical secret spot all of my own, a real treasure to be sure, just like the secret garden. I felt this rush of childlike, whimsical delight and pleasure overwhelm my senses. I tore off my shoes and dangled my feet in the water, enjoying the fresh cold wetness on my skin. I surveyed the beauty of my environment and wondered why I had never seen this part of the valley before, when I had been exploring with my dad. I could see the blue-purple silhouettes of the tall mountains standing proudly against the azure blue sky, dotted with white fluffy clouds. There were large, regal-looking eagles with massive wingspans soaring majestically across the sky, and I could hear the sounds of pretty bird calls in the valley, and watched in delight as a mother doe with her fawn came to drink at the stream. I saw her watching me, but she didn't seem overly concerned by me, and continued to drink very thirstily. I did not know how long I spent in this open clearing, overlooking the glorious green hilly valleys. I had long since forgotten about my parents, who were probably wondering where I was by now, but I really didn't care. I had found this secret, enchanting spot in nature. Besides, it felt great to be away from that witch. I lay back on this warm, sunny rock that was a part of a rocky outcrop that surrounded the beautiful, gushing, pebbling stream with its clear, sparkling water and white, pretty, bubbling foam. I cradled my head in my arms and fell into a deep sleep. As I started to awaken, I could hear this excited chattering sound of two people having a fast conversation in a foreign tongue, and I got the impression that they were talking about me. It sounded like that. I was still in a dreamy state of being half asleep and half awake. I was sure I must be hallucinating or seeing things, because as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I saw two little creatures standing before me. When I say little, I don't mean little in terms of the physical sense, but I mean you could sense they were young, they were juveniles in age, of about 4 foot tall. But I really had never seen anything like them before. I could sense their young, excitable energy. They were studying me with an open fascination, as if I was something so unusual and so out of place. The one creature reached out with a big hairy hand and touched my skin, almost as if he was comparing my skin to his own. His expression was one of enthused awe, as if he was marvelling me like you would a great work of art. And by the way he or she was looking at me, I must have been like a Michelangelo masterpiece to them. They both appeared to find me absolutely fascinating, but the feeling was neutral, because I was equally astonished by what I was seeing. I had never seen creatures like this before, and I did not know that creatures like this even existed in North America. If they did, no one had ever told me about them before. Not my parents, not science books, not anything. I reached out and touched the creature's hairless face, and marvelled at how velvety and smooth the skin was. The creature had warm brown eyes that were friendly and inquisitive, had a prominent forehead, a flat nose, and thin lips. The only thing I can say about the creatures were that they were definitely primates, but they were also very definitely human. And I think it was that humanness that we identified in each other that made us relatable. Even though I did not understand what the creatures were saying, they would mimic their intentions, and their acting was brilliant. I could almost understand them, even though no words were spoken between us. Suddenly both of the creatures looked in the distance, as if they could sense someone was coming, and then they hid me behind a large tree trunk and made gestures for me to stay quiet. I felt as if they were hiding me for someone they knew would not be pleased to see me. Suddenly I noticed everything in the valley went very still and quiet, and then I heard this heavy sound, rather like a really stocky bull walking through the undergrowth. Standing there, I saw this massive creature, which must have been the creature's mother, because she was 8 feet tall, 800 pounds, and had a pair of dangling breasts that had lost their elasticity due to gravity. The creature was covered with brown cinnamon hair, with red tufts growing through. Her hair was smooth and long, and it shone in the midday sun, like a healthy head of hair would. The mother had a very obvious cone-shaped head, which was not as blatantly apparent on her youngsters, and she had virtually no neck, and the hugest shoulders and the smoothest face I've ever seen. Her body was long and lanky, her legs slim and muscular, her arms and chest were enormous, like a first-class athlete that performs in major marathons. The creature was agile, strong, and incredibly muscular. I was glad to be hiding from her, because her sheer size intimidated me, and a one-on-one encounter would have been very frightening for me. She continued to chatter with her kids for quite a time, and in my opinion they were speaking a very clear primate language. Suddenly I could hear the sound of human voices in the valley. "She could be around here," I heard one man say. I could hear my mother crying out in dismay, "Angelica, Angelica, Angelica, where are you?" I realised that my mother had called out a search party with all the locals, and they were looking for me. I have never seen creatures react as fast to human voices as these creatures did. I watched the juveniles jump onto their mother's back with the agility of a monkey, and they scurried up the foliage of a large tree, where they seemed to squirrel themselves to the top of the large canopy, and almost become one with the green leaves at the very top of the tree. I do not believe you would have spotted them in plain sight. That was how invisible they became. The mother herself seemed to blend into the scenery, and even though I knew she was hiding, I actually could not see her. It was like she had vanished and disappeared. Suddenly I saw my mother, and she looked so frantic and hot and bothered that I ran out of my hiding space to comfort her. "Oh, Angelica," my mother cried, "why did you run off like that? We've been so awfully worried about you. Something quite dreadful could have happened to you. Have I not warned you about cougars and mountain lions before?" My mother was more happy to see me than she was angry with me. I told her that that witch-like woman had scared me half to death, and she did seem to understand. "We had to be nice to her," said my mother. "She was our guest, you see." "But what about all the horrible stuff she said about Daddy? It was so cruel, it was so unkind." "I don't think she intended to be mean, darling. It's just what she claims to have seen in your dad's hands, that's all." "But it's not true, Mummy, is it?" I asked. "I don't want Daddy to die like that," I said. "Of course it's not true," said my mother, taking me into her arms and cradling me. "Is that why you ran away? You didn't want her to look at your hand?" I nodded. "I don't want her saying horrible stuff to me like she did to Daddy." "Of course not," said my mother. "But she's gone now. Do you know what she called you? She said you had an eagle spirit." "What's that?" I asked. "The soul of a truth seeker, someone who wants to find answers to life's many mysteries. Well, that's what she said to us anyway." It was not long after meeting that witch-like woman that her prediction came true about my father. He was in a restaurant one day with some members of the Forestry Commission, including their wives, so my mother was there too. There was a shootout at the restaurant involving the 4 robbers. One woman in the restaurant fainted in terror when the robbers demanded that everybody in the restaurant open their wallets and hand over their jewelry. My father rushed to this lady's aid, and one of the ladies shot both my dad and the lady at point-blank range, and they were killed instantly. After my father's untimely demise, my mother sold our land against the wishes of my father. I think he would have understood, though, why she needed to let go of the place that held so many beautiful memories for her, which were haunting reminders of her dreadful loss. We finally sold up and moved to Boston, where my mother became a head baker for a local cake shop. My mother never married again, but she did develop high blood pressure, but is still going strong at 80 years old. All these years later, I think about my encounters with the 2 young creatures, which I now know to be Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It was only by chance I discovered a program that talked about these creatures as being elusive and impossible to find. I do believe that to be true, because they do know how to blend in with their environment, and I think they do that for survival. I would not mind betting that people have directly looked at a Sasquatch in plain sight and never seen it, even if it was yards away or in touching distance. Nothing would surprise me about those creatures.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my heart was heavy, weighted down by the oppression of my regret, and of all the missed opportunities in my life that I'd thrown to the wayside and dismissed due to the bull-headed way I sometimes handled things. I sat by the crackling fire, watching the golden flames dance around the timber in the hearth, as it spitted, popped, hissed and sizzled. There was something rather reassuring about a cosy warm fire on a cold winter's night, but even the fire didn't warm the coldness in my heart. I sat back on my leather recliner, lifting up the leg area, flickering the control on my television, but every station did not resonate with me. It was absolute drivel, from boring sports commentators to television presenters putting on those dreadful cheerful laughs. When you're feeling as flat as a pancake and as grumpy as a belligerent badger, those fake laughs can be so nauseating. I sighed and poured myself a Manhattan, taking a huge swig of the pungent cocktail to console myself. As soon as the alcoholic beverage hit the back of my throat, burning it slightly, I felt relief, so I poured myself another. That was so much better. I glanced around my Seattle apartment with a cursory look. It really was a man cave that could certainly do with a feminine touch. It was begging for a touch of the savoir-faire to soften the rough edges of my apartment. A vase of flowers, some attractive curtains, some interesting artwork would not go amiss in this apartment of mine. that was begging for a woman's finer touch. Indeed, many of my former female guests had remarked on how stark my home actually was. My living room boasted a large bookshelf that extended across the entire right-hand side of the wall, bursting to the seams with detective novels. There was a chunky brown leather settee with a furniture that was designed for comfort rather than elegance. A large ornate walnut coffee table. On its surface was a bowl of fresh green apples, along with the in-house telephone, a notepad and pencil. There was a large fluffy cream rug that graced the oak wooden floors, and of course central stage was the stunning fireplace with the oak mantel, balancing a few of my knickknacks. The walls of my home were undressed, apart from a picture I'd bought at the flea market of President Abraham Lincoln, who was positioned over the mantel in my living room. Sometimes I had drunk a little too much. It would seem that the eyes on the portrait would almost come alive. It was at times like these that I would toast Mr. Abraham Lincoln himself, as I was doing so now with my Manhattan. "Good evening to you, good sir," I said, swinging my glass towards the picture. "May God bless America." Interrupting the precious silence was the nagging sound of the telephone. I lifted the receiver. "Hello, darling," came my mother's voice. "Hi, Mum," I groaned. "Sweetheart, I'm worried sick about you. You haven't been yourself recently. Last time I saw you, I noticed your pants were getting rather loose. I'm worried you're losing weight and that you're not eating. It's because of Melanie, isn't it?" "Mum, please, let's not go there. My personal life really is not your business." "Oh, but it is my business. Everything that concerns you is my business. I'm your mother, after all. If my son is distressed about something, I'd very much like to help. What on earth happened? I thought you and Melanie were so perfect together. What went wrong between the two of you?" "I'd rather not go there, Mum, if you don't mind." "Sometimes, sweetheart, it helps to talk about these things. I can see this breakup has hit you very hard." "I don't want to talk about it, Mum. Please, will you go now?" "Look, I don't want to be a nag, but you're keeping yourself warm, aren't you? It's freezing out there. There's quite a wind tonight. I worry that you're not eating enough." "Mum, I'm very warm. I'm sitting by a crackling fire, and I've eaten enough." "Good, sweetheart. I do worry about you. I'm your mother. It's my privilege." "Bye, Mum. Nice talking to you." I sighed as I put the telephone down. Why did my mother have to bring up Melanie's name again? It had been 3 months since I'd broken up with her. I was cursing myself for such an impulsive, off-the-cuff decision. It made me physically sick to think about what had happened between the two of us. Reliving that night over again was not what I wanted to do. The moment I met Melanie, I realised that she was different to anybody else I'd ever known. I had blown it with her, like I did with every other relationship I ever had. Why was I such a disaster at dating women? Other men seemed to land with their bums in a field of clover, but not me. Over and over again I kept making the same mistakes with women. My problem was jealousy. I hated to admit it, but the green-eyed monster had reared its ugly head in many of my relationships. When I got jealous, I literally blew smoke out of my nostrils, acted irrationally, impulsively, until I not only rocked the boat, but I capsized the bloody thing in the process. What can I do? Like most men, I had to live with my mistakes, and that was not easy. I had met Melanie when I was flying back from Vegas to Washington. She had ended up sitting next to me on the plane. A fine dusting of serendipity touched my life that day, like the sprinkles of icing snow on a mince pie. I remember she was reading exactly the same Agatha Christie novel as I was. We were astounded that two people on exactly the same plane should be reading the same novel at exactly the same time, only pages apart. I was on page 102, she was on page 103. I mean, what were the chances of that? As you can imagine, that was really an icebreaker. We both talked the whole way back to Washington, about the books we appreciated reading, the wonderful countries we'd visited, the things that we enjoyed doing. I'd realised we had so much in common. I knew I wanted to see her again. She was easy on the eye, with long dark brown hair, highlighted with blonde streaks, sparkling hazel eyes, with 2 cheeky dimples on either side of her cheek that made her look younger than her years, as similarly we were both in our early 30s. "We must do this again," I said, taking down her number, tucking it in my wallet. But for some reason I lost it. I had stupidly written it on a $10 note with a red marker. I imagine I must have paid someone with that $10 note. It wasn't the cleverest or brightest idea of mine. I had no idea where she worked, what she did for a living, or even what her surname was. So I resigned myself to the fact that I had let a good thing slip through my fingers like butter. I was so disappointed with myself, as anyone I dated after meeting her was just so dull by comparison. Melanie had struck me as having such a great sense of humour, had been easy to talk to, so our conversation had flowed without any awkward silences. About 5 months later, when my nephew had to go into accident and emergency after making a petrol bomb, would you believe it, with his best friend Thomas in my backyard, it exploded, causing him to acquire some 3rd-degree burnings on his lower arm. My yard shed had completely been obliterated as shards of timber were scattered all over the lawn like pieces of shrapnel from a war scene, while neighbours came dashing out of their houses frantically to find the source of the ear-piercing explosion that was far too close for comfort. "Oh my God!" people were screaming. "What happened?" They were to see one child writhing in agony, one decimated yard shed, and one young boy looking sheepish, trying to explain to the wary neighbours why he'd made a petrol bomb in the first place, his childish reasoning not impressing the neighbours at all. "It was only a bit of fun." While one of the neighbours had called the emergency services and ambulances had arrived on the scene to escort my nephew to hospital, his friend was being given the 3rd degree. "What do you think you're doing, young man? Do you realise you could have been killed or harmed an innocent bystander? What possessed you to do such an incredulous thing?" "It wasn't supposed to go off like that," he had explained. "It was supposed to go off like a firecracker. I told you, it was only a bit of fun. We got the instructions off YouTube." When I arrived at the hospital with my nephew, who should be the doctor on duty dealing with his burns, but Melanie herself, serendipity had powdered my life again. I watched in awe as she attended to my nephew's wounds. I was the one who brought him into the hospital, as I regret to say it was my backyard where the kids had made that petrol bomb, something my sister was not best pleased about. "Really, Robin," she had chided, "you know what young boys can be like. My son is always getting up to mischief. You should have kept a better eye on him. He could have been killed. They both could have been killed." I knew she was absolutely right about that. I had failed abysmally in my duty in taking better care of them. Even my neighbours said as much. It was weighing heavily on my conscience when I brought my nephew into accident and emergency. He was in a great deal of pain, but luckily the wound looked worse than it actually was. I'm only grateful that his friend was unscathed, and that the burns on my nephew were just relegated to his lower arm. When Melanie approached me, I was too distracted to really notice her. "The good news, Mr. Boxwell," she informed me, "is your son is going to be absolutely fine. He'll make a full recovery. Unfortunately, he will sustain some permanent scarring on his lower arm. But then he can carry them proudly as battle wounds, and I'm sure he'll be quite proud of them." "He's my nephew. So you're sure he's going to be all right?" "Absolutely." She then looked at me curiously. "You look familiar. Do I know you? Have we not met somewhere before?" That was when we both realised that we had met on the aeroplane from Vegas to Washington. It was Melanie. I explained I'd lost her phone number. I had intended to get in touch. "If you want a drink sometime with me, you'll find me after work on a Wednesday night, having drinks at the bar on 3rd Street, she told me. And so it was, after we started meeting up regularly, that the romance blossomed between us. I was absolutely certain that she was the one for me. After dating for over a year, it was one evening when I was invited to a party with her where the vast majority of people in attendance at this cocktail function were actually involved in medicine. She left my side almost the entire evening, spent the entire time talking to another doctor, in such engaged, animated, enthused conversation. She looked so excited, so enthralled. I became incensed, being ignored like this while my girlfriend appeared to be flirting effusively with this man. Well, that was my interpretation of the event, watching her from a distance, that was. The pool party was around a large sweeping swimming pool, where no one was swimming, but there were lots of drinks flowing. Exotic, colourful cocktails with cherries and pineapples and little umbrellas garnishing the drinks, and exotic trays full of delicious snacks, along with gatherings of people who all knew each other very well. They drank champagne together, talking about medicine, so I truly felt like a fish out of water, as I hovered over the buffet table to get personally better acquainted with a platter of salmon bellinis and caviar that appeared to be beckoning me, calling my name. A young man approached the table, grinning at me brightly. "I saw you earlier on in the evening with Melanie," he said. "Abandoned you, has she?" "Something like that," I said. "You're not in medicine, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm an engineer." "Thought so." "There you go," he teased. "The problem with being in medicine is sometimes all we ever talk about is medicine, even after we come home after a hard day's work. I can see Melanie is caught up in conversation over there with Dr. Radcliffe. Fascinating man he is. But she'll be back soon. Don't you worry." He was wrong about that, for Melanie did offer me some apologetic glances from a distance, even mouthing a few "I'm sorries," but she basically abandoned me all night. I was livid. My evening was spent parked around the buffet table like a spare part, having scant, meaningless conversations with people who were helping themselves to snacks, about the quality of the olives and where to source the best smoked salmon. At the end of the evening, as Melanie climbed into the truck with me, so that I could drop her off at her apartment, I piped, "I hope you're happy with yourself. Had a nice evening, did you? I'm glad someone did. I was bored as hell with only the olives and salmon bellinis for company. I barely saw you all evening. Thanks for ignoring me and abandoning me like that." "Oh, it was a brilliant evening," she said, her eyes twinkling, ignoring my sarcastic comments. "Do you know who that doctor was? Do you realise who I was speaking to?"
"No, I don't. Neither do I want to. I could see you were getting very cosy with him."
"It wasn't like that, Robin. This was the first chance I got to speak to Dr. Radcliffe about some of the pioneering treatments they've recently developed for burn victims. It's exciting, revolutionary stuff."
"So you abandoned me all evening to talk about burns with this Dr. Radcliffe, did you? Do you realise I felt like a prize idiot standing there all on my own, looking so gormless, while my girlfriend is outrageously flirting with the man? How do you think that made me feel?"
"I'm sorry. I got carried away. I'm passionate about medicine, passionate about burns. I wasn't flirting. I was excited about what he was telling me, about some groundbreaking breakthroughs, that's all. It was perfectly innocent."
"You mean you're passionate about Mr. Radcliffe? I could see the way that you were ogling him."
"You've got it all wrong, Robin. It wasn't like that. You're making me cross now. I'm sorry I abandoned you. It wasn't intentional. This was the only opportunity I had to meet Mr. Radcliffe myself. He's not the kind of person who socialises much. To be able to talk to him like this was such a fabulous opportunity. It was wonderful to be able to talk to him about cutting-edge treatments. They were so brilliant. I learnt so much this evening. The future in burn medicine is looking very promising." I gritted my teeth angrily, and then I said something that I couldn't unsay.
"It's over, Melanie. We're over. I don't think we should see each other again."
I spouted this angrily, my words spitting out like fire from a dragon's mouth. Melanie sat there staring out of the windscreen, not saying a single word. I could see there were tears brimming in her eyes. "Fine, if that's what you want. If you must know, I think you've been very unreasonable, very pig-headed." For the rest of the journey she kept her eyes pinned on the road. Then I dropped her off at her apartment. She climbed out of the car, slammed the door behind her, walked away, not saying a single word, but I did know she was crying. Regretfully, those were the last words I'd spoken to her. My pride had stopped me from calling her back. 3 months had gone by, and there were so many times I was eager to phone her, but I just couldn't. I knew I was the one that had overreacted, seen things that weren't actually there. My girlfriend was just guilty of meeting an illustrious, distinguished doctor with a remarkable reputation in the field of burns, who was able to tell her all about the innovative spearheading breakthroughs in burn treatments. She was just so fascinated about the subject that she had forgotten about the time, also about me. I suppose in the circumstances it was perfectly understandable, but for some reason I had said things I didn't mean to say, ended a relationship that meant the world to me. I knew I was a complete and utter and total fool. As I sat there pondering over this, so many regrets surfaced in my mind. I wanted to see my girlfriend again, but I didn't know how to go about breaking the ice or apologising to her. For all I know, she could be dating that Dr. Radcliffe fellow by now. The thought made my belly burn with indignation. The fire was now dying in the crate. It was cold out there with icy blizzard winds blowing. I could hear the winds howling outside, beating against the windows of my home, causing the boughs of the trees to sway vigorously. I just knew that I wanted to see Melanie. I didn't want to phone her. I wanted to see her right now, to apologise for overreacting. My mother's phone call seemed to have jolted me out of my slumber, brought me to my senses. I knew I didn't want to give up on Melanie, nor on us. So despite the crazy weather, I decided to take that drive in my car. It was a Friday night. I knew that on every second weekend Melanie was off. She loved to spend it at her parents' quaint wooden cabin in the countryside, an hour outside Seattle, where we'd spent many a happy weekend together. I'd go there right now, I thought. I was certain I remembered the way. Well, at least I hoped I did. A lingering dread hovered over the back of my mind, that she could be entertaining a new man in her life. Jealous twinges stung me like hundreds of jellyfish, as I remembered the way that my girlfriend had hung on to the acclaimed Mr. Radcliffe's words at that party, as if they were gold dust. Imagine if the two of them were together. I could hardly bear the thought. I knew I was crazy. I was mad, but my relationship with Melanie was worth fighting for, every inch of it. I just hoped that she would feel exactly the same. If she didn't, well, there wasn't much I could do about it, but I knew I'd never forgive myself if I didn't at least try. I threw on my anorak. The southwesterly wind was blowing fiercely, but I made the hasty dash back to my truck, climbing inside. There was a biting chill in the air. My cheeks burned as gusts of icy cold air thrashed them like cold slapping hands. It was a dark, velvety night, with clusters of silvery stars twinkling from the earth's vast canopy, while a bright full moon caressed the sky with an effusive light, rendering the sky a light grey colour, which meant the visibility wasn't too bad. I sighed with relief. I knew driving in the dark could be exceedingly intimidating. I could hear the cheerful, reassuring chorus of the crickets and frogs as I left my green leafy neighbourhood, driving down Seattle's prominent asphalt roads. Much later on in the journey, I took a swift left-hand turn and veered off onto a remote dusty road well off the beaten track. I put on the radio, listened to the news and tuned in to Cairo News and Talk. I could see the wind was blowing fiercely. The occasional small piece of tree fall, usually an unstable branch cropped with clusters of leaves, had snapped off, was lying precariously in bedraggled heaps on the side of the road. There were many of them like that. This was some wind that was not for the faint-hearted. I was getting close to Melanie's parents' cabin when the red dirt road that I was supposed to turn down was blocked by a large tree that had seemingly fallen into the middle of the road, completely blocking my path. Oh, damn, I thought, just my luck. A log in the middle of the road barricading the way. This was all I needed. I climbed out of my truck, pondering whether I should move this thing or not. It was a sizable tree. I wasn't actually sure if I could shift it out of the way. As I approached the fallen tree to examine it better, something slipped out of the dark shadows. It was a figure moving towards me so graciously. It looked like it was floating. I froze to the spot, for the silhouette was easily over 8 foot tall. To my amazement, it ran up to me, waving its overlong arms at me frantically to get my attention. In the shafts of soft moonlight that dappled the contours of her body in an ethereal light, I could see her features. Her human-like face wore an expression of dread. The brown, deep-set eyes were troubled. For a second her eyes locked into mine. She held my gaze for a moment. It was almost as if she was scanning my thoughts, reading my heart, deciding whether she could trust me or not. That was when in my head I could hear an audible female voice pleading with me. Please help, my baby, My baby. I realised at once that this creature was a Bigfoot. She towered above me like a very substantial tall tree, solidly built like an army tank, with a pyramid-shaped head, covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms. The creature suddenly thrust a 3-foot creature towards me, that I realised was her youngling. She was pointing to its chest, making a howling sound. To my horror, I saw that its chest had been impaled with a tree branch, as the long thin sapling had plundered its chest to the other side, so that the tree branch had seared him like a skewer. It was the kind of injury that could affect the heart or cause a lung to collapse, both potentially fatal injuries. It was quite literally the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. The youngling looked terribly afraid, his mother even more so. It was amazing that the mother was so intelligent. She knew better than to remove the tree branch from her youngling's chest, seemed fully aware of the implications of such an injury. I was amazed that she was reaching out to me for help. She was so desperate. I knew this little whimpering creature did need my help. Not for a moment did I consider my own fear. I bustled the creature quickly into the front of my truck. Luckily, at 3 foot tall, it was really rather small, while the branch jutting through him was about 2 feet long. I made sure the creature was sitting in the perfect position in the front seat, so that no pressure was exerted on the branch to potentially cause more damage. I looked up at the mother, and I said to her, "I'll see what I can do." I could see a hope rising up in her brown eyes as she let me take her youngling under my charge. I needed help as soon as possible, and who better than Melanie to help me in this bizarre situation? I could hardly call an ambulance for a creature that was not exactly human, but then again, it really was. The large creature moved the fallen tree from across the road to one side so that I could get by. I realised she must have strategically placed it there to get help for her youngling, by reaching out to a human of all things. Melanie's cabin was not far from here. I could only hope that she would be there now, more than ever. I found the familiar sign in the road which read the Lazy Bear Lodge. I was now on the right path. It was a disagreeable drive, my truck jolting, wobbling, shuddering down the precipitous rocky driveway that led directly to the cabin. An uncomfortable trip, causing the little critter to let out agonized cries, as the poor thing winced, recoiled, and flinched in pain with every single bump. Finally, I was parked outside Melanie's cabin, but to my horror there were 2 other cars parked there as well, that I didn't recognise at all. The cabin looked more like a large chalet with a lovely wraparound porch. I didn't waste any time. I ran up to the front door. I know it was late at night. The wind was howling, beating and whipping my clothes. I began banging at the door as hard as I could. "Melanie! Melanie!" Melanie came to the front door, wearing a pink dressing gown, her hair all tousled, her eyes very sleepy. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she gasped. "I need your help urgently, Melanie. I've got a patient in the front of my truck. He's been impaled." "Well, haven't you called the emergency services yet?" she asked, looking shocked. "Why on earth did you bring him back to my cabin? He needs specialist care right now. An impalement is a serious injury." "That's not possible, Melanie. The patient's not entirely human. Can you not help him?" "Not entirely human?" asked Melanie, looking nonplussed. "What are you talking about?" "It's a little Bigfoot," I explained. "Its mother entrusted me with her youngling. She wants us to help him. She's desperate." "What's going on?" asked 2 female figures emerging through the doorway, with worried expressions on their faces. Both women were also wrapped in dressing gowns. Their hair looked tousled like Melanie's. It was clear that all 3 doctors were spending a girls' weekend together at her cabin. I couldn't have been in better hands with this little Bigfoot. Melanie turned around to her friends. "We're going to have to help a little Bigfoot. It's been impaled. Naturally, we can't take it to hospital because it's not human. We have to work on it here, hope for the best. Are you up for it, guys?" "Is this some kind of a wind-up?" "A Bigfoot? No, you're joking. Are you really being serious?" came the stunned response. "I mean, are those things even actually real?" "Wait and see," I said. "I'll be bringing him in now." The wind whipped against us as me and Melanie ran as quickly as we could to my truck, helping to guide the little Bigfoot out of the door. The poor thing was whimpering. He seemed overwhelmed with so many human eyes fixated on him, staring at him in wondrous awe. as seeing a Bigfoot certainly astounded the doctors, as it had done for me. But then their attention was rightly turned towards helping the idiosyncratic creature. He was a lanky little thing, with thin legs, overlong arms, and a stocky torso for one so young. "It's going to be all right," said Melanie, grabbing the Bigfoot's hand kindly and bringing him into the cabin. The creature looked at her with its bright, frightened dark eyes. "We're going to do our best to help you, I promise," she said to him.
Is he going to be all right, Melanie? Is he going to die?
"It depends on a lot of things," Melanie told me. "It depends whether the sapling has caused any internal damage. The creature's fortunately got a large chest. We can only hope that the impalement has not caused internal bleeding, rupturing or puncturing. We're just going to have to pray that everything goes well. Keep your fingers crossed. We haven't got the technology here that we have at the hospital for scans and stuff like that. I can't promise you that the youngling is going to survive, but we'll do our level best to make sure that he does. That's all we can hope for in the circumstances." They took the little creature into a little room where Melanie had some medical supplies, and as luck would have it, an oxygen tank. I sat back awkwardly on the comfortable upholstered chair in the living room, clenching my fists anxiously, knowing full well that things could go terribly pear-shaped. I was solicitous and disquieted about the poor Bigfoot mother, who'd reached out to me for help. How would she react if I returned her youngling back to her dead? Even more extraordinary, how did that poor thing manage to get impaled by a branch? It was all exceedingly bizarre. I began to pace around the cabin anxiously, while the wind continued to howl outside the windows, and the Douglas fir trees in the woodgrove that surrounded the cabin were almost dancing in the wind. I could hear the youngling's painful cries coming from the room. I tried to block my ears. The sound was very disturbing. "Please, God," I prayed, don't let this poor thing die." As my anxiety escalated, I could feel a cold chill running down my spine, so I busied myself restocking the timbers of the fire in the crate. Some of the timber was still smouldering from the evening's fire, so I added some timber along with some steel wool. A perfect fire starter. In a trice the fire was burning brightly in the crate. I glanced around the living area, and there were dirty wine glasses smeared with lipstick marks on the rims. They were on the coffee table, along with a massive pizza box and dirty plates. I decided to distract myself, so I took the dirty plates and glasses to the sink and began to wash up the dishes. It felt good to keep myself busy and occupied. I glanced out of the kitchen window of the cabin. I could see the tall silhouette of the mother Bigfoot pacing up and down as she moved between the tall Douglas firs and the woodgrove. I was stunned. She'd followed us all the way to the cabin. She looked like any other mother in a hospital waiting room, frantically worried about their child. I was struck by how human she appeared, despite the fact that she was so enormous from every perspective. Melanie finally entered the kitchen. In her hand she held the sapling branch that had pierced the Bigfoot. I took it into my hands, marvelling that this thing had gone right through the torso of a little youngling. It was badly smeared with blood. "I'm sorry," she said. "We did everything we could." Her face looked stern and very sober. I dropped the sapling branch on the ground, where it fell on the wooden floor with a crash. I wrapped my arms over my head and began to cry out in despair.
"Please, God, it's not dead. Please don't tell me it's dead."
"Don't be silly, I'm only kidding," teased Melanie. "It went seamlessly. The news is good. There wasn't much bleeding at all. The sapling branch didn't touch any vital organs or even touch the lungs, so he's a very lucky Bigfoot indeed. We've stitched him up very nicely and he's good to go, but he'll be a bit tender in that spot for a while, but no harm's been done, so it was an excellent job all in all." All three doctors entered the room smiling brightly, with very happy-looking expressions on their faces, with the little Bigfoot walking beside them. His eyes were so filled with joy. He darted towards the sapling on the floor and began chattering excitedly to us in a strange language as he examined it. "That's right," said Melanie. "That was in you. Can you believe it? But we got it out." The creature began to bounce up and down like an excitable dog. "I think we should give him something to eat," said Melanie. "The poor creature's had a nasty shock." She rifled through her fridge, bringing out a large slice of apple pie for the creature. When presented with the apple pie, the creature lifted it up to his flat nose and sniffed it. Then he took a bite, loved the taste. He virtually poured the contents of the entire plate down his mouth, chewing it happily and presenting his plate back to Melanie for another slice. She couldn't refuse him. I think he ended up eating the entire pie, but nobody was saying a word. "I'll be back in a moment," I said. "I need to get the mother. I saw her in the wood grove anxiously pacing up and down between the Douglas fir trees. I think she's desperate to get news of her youngling. It took her an enormous amount of courage to reach out to me to get help. She even blocked the road with a timber beam so that I was forced to get out of my truck, which was when she approached me." "Wow, I'm impressed. That is incredible," said Melanie. "What a resourceful mother, who would stop at nothing to help her child, even if it meant reaching out to a human. She was clever not to remove the sapling pole from her youngling's torso. You go and get her, Robin." I opened the cabin door to be hit by the whipping currents of ice-cold air, and of course the howling wind. It was freezing out there. The wind had gained strength, so I felt as if my whole body was being pummelled against a powerful force, but I didn't even care. Out of the trees a shadowy figure moved towards me so gracefully. Once again she looked like she was floating. It was the Bigfoot female. I could see that her deep-set dark eyes were full of anxiety, but one look at me and she seemed to sense that the news was good, as a light came on in her eyes. It would seem her deflated, sagging body rejuvenated like a flower in the meadow after the spring rain has fallen, as it straightened, which made her body appear even taller. "It all went well," I said, hoping that she could understand my words. "We couldn't have asked for a better outcome." I felt like a doctor talking to a patient's parent after an intense surgery and giving her the good news. She clearly did comprehend what I was saying, as she let out a couple of delighted whoops and began jumping up and down on her legs for joy. She followed me to the cabin. The door was flung open by Melanie. It blew back violently against the log pole beams of the cabin. The little Bigfoot came tearing out of the cabin as fast as he could. He was faster than the wind, dashing towards his mother with the sapling piece in his hands, which he couldn't wait to show her. She threw him up in the air in delight, catching him in her arms. The youngling showed her the sapling piece that had gone through him. The mother examined it with an expression of absolute wonderment on her face. She rubbed her fingers across the wound. She looked impressed to see that the hole in her son's torso had finally been sewn up. The Bigfoot female looked at us. Her eyes were full of gratitude. She nodded to us, turned around and glided away, disappearing into the trees, while the wind kept howling. "Get back inside," said Melanie, pushing me back into the cabin, "before you catch your death of cold. That wind is not about to let up any time soon." "This is Robin," she told her two friends. "Robin, this is Alice and Jennifer." "Good to meet you," I said. "Thank you for helping me out tonight." Alice grinned. I knew it was going to be exciting coming out to the cabin for the weekend with Melanie, but I never expected to be operating on a Bigfoot. This has been one of the most exciting nights of my life that I shan't forget in a hurry. I'm glad we could help the poor little fellow. But even at such a young age, he had such a robust body. If he had been fully human, he might never have survived that impalement, never. But he was built of tough stuff, that little thing. "Melanie, can I have a word?" "Of course," she said. "I miss you," I told her. "I miss us. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for overreacting at that party." "No, I'm sorry. You were right. I shouldn't have abandoned you in the way that I did at the party. It was so inconsiderate of me, selfish even. I'm the one that should be sorry. I also miss you." To cut a long story short, I'm glad to inform you that me and Melanie rekindled the flame of our relationship. We are now happily married, have been so for 20 long years. Now I know better than to get jealous when doctors get caught up in discussing medicine. We all decided to keep what happened between us with that Bigfoot youngling. We kept it a secret. We are desirous for those beautiful creatures to live together in peace without being bothered by humans. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I'd arrived in America. I was presently in a taxi cab, wondering what the hell I'd done. Coming here to the land of the great and the land of the plenty had been an off-the-cuff decision that hadn't required much sagacious thought on my part. A distant cousin of mine on my father's side of the family, who I'd never had the privilege to actually meet, had spontaneously agreed to engage in an apartment swap with me for over 6 months. My father had told me not to look a gift horse in the mouth, to say yes to this temporary exchange. This was the quintessential opportunity that I couldn't afford to miss, he had assured me. "It'll do you good, sweetheart.
experiencing life in another country. I will cover all your expenses for the next 6 months. How about that?"
My father was a man of great wisdom and insight, so I had listened to him diligently. I knew he was absolutely right. I was about 24 at the time, with a desire to one day run my own cafe in London, where I would provide coffee and sandwiches for those desiring a light snack or a quick bite to eat. I had enrolled in a 6-month cookery course in Seattle that was starting in a week's time. I would be learning the secrets to fine French cuisine, under the culinary guidance and expertise of the accomplished master chef Jules Toussaint. It was ironic that I was learning from a French master in America rather than in Paris, but there we go. Stranger things have indeed happened. But little did I realize the next few days of my life were about to get exceedingly strange. We had made this impetuous, impromptu decision an entire week ago. My cousin would be moving into my living quarters in London, and I would be moving into his illustrious condo in Seattle. But I'd never met him, so in effect I was moving into a stranger's accommodation, and vice versa. I'd warned him that my unpretentious abode in London was cosy, cheerful and homely, but it wasn't grandiose or extravagant in any way. It was a 1-bedroom penthouse with a tiny, very well-equipped kitchenette, living area, dining room and bathroom. Very small but quaint. But the best part about it was centrally located in Bayswater. Bayswater is a very cosmopolitan, multicultural part of London, a buzzing, energetic metropolis with vibrant, colourful streets full of brisk, bustling pedestrians, black London taxicabs, red London buses, restaurants, food shops and apartments. On the outside, the apartments in the large white Georgian building where I lived were very ornate and expensive to look at. The architecture was exceedingly impressive, with pediments, columns and arches, and you could be forgiven for believing that the flats contained therein were very ostentatious, but nothing could be further from the truth, as the interiors were pretty standard. Needless to say, I had successfully managed to make my home into an expression of myself, sumptuous, snug, colourful and congenial. I discerned that my cousin's apartment, from what I could gather, was in a very grandiose, opulent apartment block that looked flamboyant, as it did theatrical, from the pictures my cousin had actually sent me. I was doing exceedingly well on this deal. My father was American, but this was the first time I'd ever visited his homeland. I remember as a child growing up in England, whenever England and America were caught up in sports games together, there would be conflict in our household between my mother and my dad over the sports in question, which was a real joke, as my mother was as interested in sports as a rabbit would be interested in a filet mignon. I think my mother just loved to ruffle my father's feathers, teasing him mercilessly. "England is going to win," she'd say. "England is going to win," while my father would swear a devoted, undivided allegiance to America. "Nonsense! America's going to win! America's going to win!" My mother would give me a huge teasing wink, knowing full well she had achieved the desired effect on my father, who was getting heated under the collar. She loved working him up into a lather. In truth, although she was British, she didn't give a toss whether England lost to America or not, but she loved winding my poor father up. Of course, I was supposed to be neutral, like Switzerland, not getting involved in any way, as my father always reminded me that I was half American, a fact that I was never allowed to forget, not even for a single moment. "You may sound and even look like the quintessential English rose, dear, with your fair, peachy skin, dark hair and blue eyes. But don't ever forget, half the blood running through your veins, Arabella, is American. So you're an English rose with an exotic American touch." I'd always liked the sound of that. What woman wouldn't appreciate being called exotic? It left the girl next door look flying out of the window, made me appear mysterious, exciting. Not that I was either one of those, of course. But now I was in America, sitting in this taxicab, as the taxi driver drove through the streets of Seattle, while the pelting rain thrashed against the windscreen. I noticed his windscreen wipers were working vigorously to push away the sloshing droplets of water that bespeckled the glass. It didn't help that the gridlock frenzied traffic was really quite hectic, with despairing, frustrated drivers honking their horns and patience running thin. I had expected my taxi driver to be an all-American man, but he looked like he was from the Middle East, with that yellow skin tone, very prominent lips, a sloped forehead, a larger bridge on the nose, and a less prominent tip on the chin. He was wearing a bright orange turban, sporting a white moustache, thicker on one side than on the other, reminding me of many of the foreigners I encountered on the streets of Bayswater, where there's a thriving, somewhat blossoming Arab community. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, as Seattle was also a cosmopolitan city. "Is it always raining like this here in Seattle?" I asked the driver curiously.
"It's very changeable here. We're known for having 3 seasons in one day. It can pour with rain, and the next minute the sun comes out, just like that. Here in Seattle, we can wear a sweater, a coat, a sundress, and a raincoat in one day. That's how changeable the seasons are. I gather from what I've heard it rains a lot in England. Is that right?"
"Yes, it rains a lot there. We even get rather bad flooding at times that can wreak havoc on people's homes. Personally, I've never been adverse to the rain. A lot of people are, but not me. I like how fresh it makes everything."
"Me too," agreed the taxi driver. "But around here the rain doesn't stop people driving atrociously. I mean, look at them. But then who am I to complain? I'm from Cairo in Egypt, you see. People there drive like reckless maniacs, worse than here. You'll find traffic congestion building up in the road as 2 people hold everybody else up, engaging in a personal dispute like a brother having a huge altercation with his next-door neighbour about the family chickens. And they'll stand there pointing accusatory fingers at each other while the traffic congestion mounts up behind them. I call it roadside drama myself. Forget your soaps on television. The live soaps on the streets of Cairo are certainly worth watching. The honking horns there, they never stop. You can hear them at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's insane. So however bad the traffic is here in Seattle, I shouldn't complain. I should be grateful for small mercies, however small they may seem."
"Here we are," said the taxi, veering his taxi to the right and making a swift turn, driving towards this incredible 19th century-looking apartment block with Italianate Tuscan architectural influences. Only instead of being built on 3 stories in the usual way, it towered into many stories to create an impressive high-rise apartment block, with overhanging eaves, gentle sloping roofs, decorated by brackets, cornices, a square cupola and porches topped with balustrades. There was a very grand, large central courtyard of brick and limestone, elegantly embraced by a huge, highly ornamental fountain, where volumes of water cascaded into the air in white ribbons of foam. There were lemon trees growing from large terracotta pots, and pergolas filled with native climbing plants. Then there were plant borders on the outer perimeters, framed by geometrical hedges, where white roses intermingled rambunctiously with evergreen foliage, in greys, silvers, bronzes and golds. And there was a scattering of small ornamental trees that had been pristinely manicured. The taxi drove through the fabulously ornate, highly stylized black wrought iron gates, parking under a large mature oak tree, with a sweeping outstretched bough that created a canopy above our heads. I climbed out of the taxi, grabbing my suitcase from the trunk, and possibly paying the taxi driver far more than I should have done, but I wasn't sure what the going rates were, so it was far better to be safe than sorry. I made my way through the courtyard into the foyer, where I was greeted by the concierge in reception, who managed the comings and goings of all the apartments. He was a man in his early 50s, whose tanned golden-brown skin wore the evidence of old acne pigmentation, but he was exceedingly handsome in a rugged sort of way, with warm, congenial brown eyes, and a crooked nose that looked like it had taken a beating during a punch-up. I wondered what had happened to him.
"How may I help you, madam?" he asked.
"My name is Arabella," I told him. "I'm staying here in Henry Thomas's apartment."
"Oh, that's right. The girl from England. Henry told me all about you."
He handed me the keys to Henry's penthouse.
"It's number 42, the 7th floor on the north wing," he informed me. "I'll get the doorman to bring up your luggage for you."
"That's not necessary," I said. "My suitcase has got wheels. I can take it up myself in the elevator. It'll be a breeze, I promise."
"If you're sure."
"I am. Thanks for offering, though. It's very chivalrous of you."
"It's only a pleasure,"
he said, casting me a huge white smile of teeth. I took the escalator up to the 7th floor. I began to search for flat number 42. It couldn't be that hard, surely. As I neared my approach, a long, thin, willowy woman with skin so delicate it looked like fragile crepe paper covering her skull very tightly, giving her a haunted, ghostly appearance, seemed to be hammering her fists on the door of flat number 41, which must have been next to mine. She was shouting through the door, "Sabrina, are you there? Please answer me." I noticed her white face looked distraught. She looked up at me with a worried, overwrought expression on her face. "Sorry, I don't mean to intrude, nor do I mean to be a bother," she asked me as I walked past her carrying my suitcase, stopping dead in my tracks to acknowledge the woman. "But you haven't seen Sabrina anywhere, have you? I've been trying desperately to get hold of her. She hasn't been answering her cell phone for 3 days, nor has she turned up for work. Everyone is worried sick. I can't fathom what on earth has happened to her." I could see the woman's eyes were very shiny, as her eyelashes were glistening with tears. She was visibly very upset. "Look, I don't live here. I don't know Sabrina, but from what you're telling me, you should call the police. You say it's out of character for her not to be in touch." "Absolutely," said the woman. "Sabrina's always exceedingly punctual. When she says she'll be at a place, she always is. I speak to her every day on my cell, but she hasn't returned any of my calls. It's not like her. I'm worried sick. She's my best friend." "Has she been depressed recently? Behaving distant and withdrawn?" I asked. The woman looked at me in surprise. "Are you suggesting my friend is suicidal?" she asked me. "No, I'm just running through all the possibilities and options. Why people tend to go missing," I said. "Depression can make people wander off sometimes, do strange, rather incongruous things. No, she's definitely not depressed. She's one of the most positive people I know." "She doesn't take drugs or narcotics by any chance?" "No." "Well, then you must call the police, because if you can tick off all those boxes, you know something's seriously wrong with her. I can wait with you if you like, while you call them." "No, that's very kind of you. I'll be fine," said the woman. "I can see you need to get back home. You've obviously got a suitcase. You must have been somewhere." I was relieved the woman didn't accept my offer to stick around. I was shattered after the long trip. I opened the door of my apartment, twisting the keys in the lock. I had an ominous, sick feeling in my gut that the woman in next door's apartment called Sabrina was possibly more than likely dead. How I knew this, I don't know, but I did. I was so tired, so exhausted that when I got into my cousin's apartment, I decided to take a quick nap. But I appeared to sleep for many hours. I recall waking up at night, seeing flashing blue lights across the wall, like you'd expect to see with police cars. But due to my dreadful jet lag, along with the differing time zones, I was far too zonked to pay any attention to them at all. I'm almost sure I heard authoritative voices during the night. The following morning I was pretty certain that the blue lights I'd observed in a semi-conscious state were in fact real. There was a sinking feeling in my gut that would not abate. I was certain that the woman from next door's apartment was almost certainly dead, that the blue lights I'd seen belonged to the police. Imagine if she'd been murdered, that I'd come to America to move into an apartment next to a crime scene. It was like something out of a gripping Agatha Christie novel. My cousin's condo in Seattle was absolutely stunning, with huge floor-to-ceiling glass windows, overlooking exquisite waterfront views, where I could see boats gliding over the silvery lake, large sails blowing wistfully in the wind against a cloudless cobalt blue sky, while the lake appeared to twinkle and sparkle, as a golden ethereal light seemed to dance above its glittering surface, while tall statuesque trees rose up in the sky proudly, gathered together in congenial groups like old friends. There were areas of verdant manicured turf. Long ribbons of paved walkways fringed the outer edges of the lake. It was very beguiling. My cousin's apartment definitely overshadowed mine in every conceivable way, which made me feel very embarrassed about my humble little abode in Bayswater. Still, my cousin knew exactly what he was getting when he signed up for this arrangement. By all accounts, his email to me affirmed that he was very pleased with the place. It read, "Arrived at your beautiful flat. So cosy and warm. I'm thoroughly going to enjoy it here. LOL. I replied, "Arrived at your apartment safe and well. Very ornate. I think I did the best out of this deal. LOL. I glanced at the clock. I thought it must be terribly wrong. I had perceived it was morning, but it was late afternoon of the following day. I'd obviously been completely knackered, worn out from my long trip. The block-out blinds and windows hadn't helped. They made the apartment seem so dark, so I'd falsely assumed it was morning. In truth, I felt as if I could curl up in a ball and sleep for an entire week, so I was ever grateful that there were a few days left before I started my French cookery course. I decided to make myself a cup of tea in the kitchen and put the bright red kettle on the hob. I was so glad to see my cousin had brought me some tea. There was a post-it note saying, "I know how you Brits love your cuppa." There was also a large tin of mixed cookies from a chocolate chip to cinnamon and raisin. I made myself a hot cup of tea and dumped my cookie in the warm liquid. It was delicious. The chocolate in the chocolate chip cookie melted on my tongue. I briefly glanced around the apartment that had been painted in a flattering ivory tone, while the walls were aligned with this impressive collection of contemporary artwork that was full of texture, colour and depth. I was compelled to run my hands across some of the paintings to feel the ridges and lines, an enjoyable, tactile experience for me. In the hallway there was a vast collection of black and white photographs of interesting faces that I didn't know or recognise, but I imagined they were family members on my father's side, that I had not been privy to meet yet. I could see the familiar family features in the picture. I wondered if any of them were pictures of my cousin. I didn't have a clue what he looked like. The apartment looked like an interior designer had been given free rein to transform this large man cave into a very glamorous-looking penthouse that would even impress the Sultan of Brunei. That is, if he chose to go for something sophisticated, but not too palatial, as it really was first class, furnished with a combination of rococo and classic furnishings, which made the apartment both elegant and tasteful, but not too over the top. The only thing lacking in the apartment was any evidence of my cousin's soul, which I thought was a dreadful pity. I've always believed your home should reflect your personality, that you should put your own personal stamp on a place. There were no personal touches to this home that told me anything about my cousin, other than a sweeping collection of Dick Francis and Agatha Christie novels in the bookshelves. So he liked detective novels like I did. He had expensive taste, appreciated modern art, enjoyed classical music, judging by his collection there. But other than that, I knew nothing about him. As I was pondering over this in reflective thought, the doorbell suddenly rang. I ambled over quickly to the door, looking through the peephole. I could see it was a police officer that unfortunately didn't bear any resemblance to the famous fictional detective Hercule Poirot, which I thought was a pity. In truth, I can't say I was remotely surprised to see a police officer standing there in the door. Part of me was expecting a visit from the police, given that the woman next door had appeared to have gone missing. I was beginning to feel like I was playing an exciting part in one of those gripping, spellbinding movies, like Murder on the Orient Express. The only problem, the police were not going to put me down as a potential suspect, as it would have been an impossibility for me to have committed a murder, as I was flying over the Atlantic at the time. A small part of me almost fantasized about being a potential suspect, the police whispering among themselves, could it be the exotic English girl, guilty of this heinous crime? "Hello," said the police officer standing in the doorway looking at me. "I'm Officer Howard Posner. May I come in?" He was a very congenial man, with a soft Southern American drawl, which I found attractive. He was easy on the eye, with a bright smile of whiter-than-white teeth, and brown piercing eyes that were so discerning they reminded me of an eagle's. But then you did have to be astute, discriminating and insightful to be an officer on the force, surely. "Of course," I said, inviting the officer into the flat, gesturing for him to sit down on an upholstered chair, which he did so, but he sat on the very edge, looking authoritative, very businesslike. "I'm investigating the homicide of a young woman called Sabrina Cooper Fox, who lived in the apartment next door to yours. We are here to make inquiries in the apartment block to establish her last known whereabouts. We are naturally interviewing everyone in the entire building, but you are her most immediate neighbour, so I'm hoping you may remember the last time you saw her, and whether she was alone or had company." "Oh, my word! So the girl next door is dead. I thought as much. It was a gut instinct." "I'm afraid so," said the officer, stroking his chin reflectively. "Did you know Sabrina personally, or were you just passing acquaintances?" "No, officer, I don't know her at all. I only landed in America yesterday morning, courtesy of London Heathrow Airport. You see, when I arrived at the apartments, I saw an exceptionally thin young woman, frantically trying to get into Sabrina's apartment. She said she hadn't seen or heard from Sabrina for over 3 days, nor had she turned up for work. I immediately suspected that to be rather suspicious, so I encouraged her to phone the police at once. I'm presently doing a 6-month apartment swap with a cousin of mine, so he's staying in my apartment in Bayswater in London, and I'm staying here in this one in Seattle. I'm here to do a 6-month cookery course, you see, as my father was eager for me to come to America. He's American. I wish I could help you, officer, but I know absolutely nothing about Sabrina.
I see, said the officer. So your cousin would have known Sabrina then. What was his name?
His name is Henry Thomas, but I don't know him personally. Actually, we've never met before. But yes, if he lived next door to Sabrina, I imagine they must have at least known each other in passing, surely. The officer's face paled to a ghostly white, as if all the colour had faded from his face. His pronounced masculine jawline stiffened, his slender muscular body visibly straightened, rather reminding me of an alert dog that had sensed a curious noise, and its ears had stood up and become unduly guarded, very tense.
You say your cousin's name is Henry Thomas. Is that right?
That's right.
I have a report that he was the last person to be seen with Sabrina alive. I gather they were in a serious relationship together. Everyone here in the apartment block recognizes them as a couple. I was under the distinct impression he lived close to Sabrina, but I had no idea he lived in the flat next door. That is most interesting. You see, you are being very informative and most helpful.
This time it was my turn to look astonished. She was going out with my cousin? Are you being serious?
I am afraid so. Do you have his cell phone number? Asked the officer. As you will appreciate under the circumstances, I really do need to contact him ASAP.
Of course. I'll give you all his contact details. Is he a suspect in the murder? Sorry. Stupid me. A funny question to ask, I know. I've watched enough crime scene dramas to know that people closest to the victim are always considered suspects.
Well, he will need to be helping us with our inquiries. Would you mind if I do a quick search of the apartment?
Be my guest, officer. I've got nothing to hide. I only hope my cousin doesn't, but you're welcome to look around.
Well, if you prefer, I could organise a search warrant.
That's not necessary. You go ahead and search. Did you find anything of interest? I asked him, after he'd finished his brisk search of the place.
No. The apartment is spotless, rather like a hotel. Not much personal stuff around.
My thoughts exactly. That's what I thought when I got here.
Here's my card. Give me a call if anything unusual grabs your attention. I would most appreciate it.
Will do so, I said. After the officer had left, I gathered my purse in my hand, threw on a pair of jeans, a sweater and sneakers. I noticed the building was full of police officers knocking on doors, asking the residents questions. It was hard to get my head around the fact that the girl in the next-door apartment had been murdered. Worse still, she'd been dating my cousin. Was it possible that my cousin could have murdered her? The police were more than a little keen to interview him. I knew nothing about my cousin. For all I knew, he could be a psychopath. All these thoughts were whirling around my mind, taunting me, as I enjoyed a brief walk around the waterfront, with the full intention of buying a few groceries at the local store. Lake Washington was exceedingly beautiful. Many people were out taking casual runs or strolls around the lake, while some young women were out with strollers walking their babies. I found the perfect convenience store on the street corner, where I gathered some essential supplies, namely some delicious baked bread, American cheddar cheese, ham, along with a couple of bottles of white wine, and then I made the trip back home, walking all the way, with the full intention of taking it easy for the next couple of days, until I acclimatized. I'd drink wine, watch television, as I noticed my cousin had over 100 channels to choose from. It was on Thursday when there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there was a young man standing in the doorway, who bore an uncanny resemblance to my father, so much so that I physically gawped. The man had my father's handsome, warm olive complexion, bright green-brown eyes, a distinctive square jawline, a prominent nose. He also had my father's thick brown curly locks. He was dressed in a smart pair of Levi jeans with a sweatshirt that read London Rocks, which I assume he must have only just purchased when he arrived in London.
Hello, Arabella. I'm your cousin, Henry Thomas. It's so good to finally meet you.
What are you doing here? Please don't tell me that my flat was so bad in London that you just couldn't hack it and you took the next flight home. I truly didn't think it was as bad as that.
No, nothing like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. I was informed by the police that they would appreciate my flying home as quickly as possible to answer some of their police inquiries. So I hope you don't mind me occupying the spare room while you're here. I'm shattered. I would appreciate you not telling the police I'm here yet. I told them I'd be home in a week."
"Of course," I said. "I shan't say a single thing. I do understand how you feel. I'm still recovering from my long-haul flight myself. But you with 2 long-haul flights behind you, you must be completely plastered."
"Tell me about it. I don't know how those pilots do it. He said flying over such long distances. I can't imagine what it does to your body clock."
I left my cousin to sleep and went to the local shops again to buy some groceries. I had decided I'd make my cousin a traditional English favourite, toad in the hole with gravy.
"Something smells delicious," said my cousin, entering the kitchen later on in the evening, greeted to the smells of sizzling sausage.
"I hope you're hungry. I've made toad in the hole."
"What's that?"
"Sausages cooked in batter, served with gravy. I promise you won't be disappointed. It's really yummy. Men particularly love it, because I suppose it's quite stodgy, really." We ate our meal together in silence, while my cousin made some audible appreciative sounds as he ate.
"This is delicious."
I poured my cousin a large glass of wine, as I decided to broach the subject of Sabrina's death. Should I tread cautiously, I wondered, when broaching the subject? How was he affected by it? He seemed all right to me. "I'm really sorry about what happened to Sabrina. I gather she was your girlfriend, that you were in a serious relationship together. You must be very upset about what happened." My cousin did seem to tear up.
"She was the love of my life."
"Oh, I'm so sorry," I said, reaching out my hand to touch my cousin's arm. "This can't be easy for you. It must have come as a dreadful, horrifying shock to learn about her unfortunate demise. I'm not sure how she died, but the police are treating it as a homicide."
"I know all about that, from what I gleaned from the police. Can I tell you something, in the strictest confidence, Sabrina? I need to tell someone this, but I don't want you to go blabbing to the police under any circumstances."
"Go on," I said. "Try me. I'm a good listener." I was crossing my fingers and toes secretly, fully aware that if he told me something explosive, I would be forced to go to the police, especially if my cousin was involved in Sabrina's murder. The horrifying thought sent shivers down my spine. I knew absolutely nothing about my cousin, who was eating dinner with me. He could be anyone, a serial killer for all I knew. Of course he didn't look like one, but I had learnt one thing in life. Appearances can be deceptive, and not all is what it seems.
"I know why Sabrina died. It wasn't a homicide.
Well, it was, and it wasn't." "Why don't you talk to the police about it, then?" I asked. "Are you crazy? They need to know exactly what happened. You don't want them going pinning the crime on you, especially if you had nothing to do with it."
"It's not as plain sailing as that. If it was, I would have told them what happened a long time ago. But it's complicated."
I gasped. "You know about Sabrina's death?" I asked, looking at him in astonishment. "You knew about it before you flew to England. Why the heck didn't you tell someone?"
"As I was saying, it's not that straightforward. I was scared."
"So then what happened?" I asked, my steely gaze fixing on my cousin.
"Sabrina and I had decided to go rambling on this woodland trail outside Seattle. We love to go walking, exploring and adventuring. We are keen, outdoorsy people. That weekend was no exception. We left our apartments in Seattle at about 4 o'clock in the morning so that we could start our hike relatively early. We've always found early morning walks most agreeable, very invigorating. When we arrived at the hiking trail, we were the only car in the parking lot, which came as no surprise to us, given the time. We gathered our belongings from the trunk, which included light backpacks containing drinks, snacks, and a few other odds and ends. The sun was beginning to set over the horizon. Before long, the first beams of morning sunshine danced through the ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. The smell of the forest at the time of the morning was incredulous. It smelt like butterscotch. Very pleasant. We were greeted to the sounds of the dawn chorus. The bird song that filtered over the valley was magnificent. Being up so early, we encountered quite a lot of animal life. A lone fox crossed our path, looking at us curiously. He was a spectacular specimen, I have to say. Then we scared off a few deer. It was as we were walking my girlfriend heard the strange chattering sound. It was curiously bizarre. It sounded exactly like a monkey, but as you can appreciate, we don't have monkeys here in America. But that is the only way I can describe the sound to you. Sabrina loves every kind of animal. She's animal crazy. She got very excited as she followed the sound. There, perched on the tree, was a tiny creature, about the size of a small monkey. It looked like a human covered in hair, but it did have a primate-like look to it. We had no idea what it was, but it was terribly friendly towards us and very affectionate towards Sabrina. She couldn't help but pick it up, hold it in her arms, bobbing it up and down on her hips like a baby. She was making those "Oh, isn't he so cute" expressions with her face, and saying, "Oh my God, he's the most adorable thing that I've ever seen in my entire life." The critter was making these appreciative chattering sounds. It was even nibbling Sabrina's ear. It was so sweet.
I think it might be abandoned. We should definitely take it home with us.
The creature was loving the fuss that Sabrina was giving him. He was playing with her long hair, pulling it, and Sabrina was laughing. Sabrina looked hopelessly smitten, looking at me with those puppy dog eyes. I put my foot down about her keeping the strange creature. We began to argue about it. "I don't believe it's abandoned," I insisted. "I think this creature is waiting in the tree for its mother." As if on cue, with seemingly impeccable timing, we heard this god-awful noise. The only way I can describe it to you was that something was thundering through the wood grove. It sounded like a rhino was bounding towards us. Everything heaved, groaned, and vibrated under its feet. It happened so quickly, far too quickly for us to react, almost like a road traffic accident. It was unavoidable, inescapable, unfathomable. Then there she was, a Bigfoot. The creature was absolutely enormous. And when I say enormous, I can't justify the word enormous strongly enough. Perhaps the word gargantuan and titanic would be more appropriate words to describe her size. I would easily estimate she was between 8 and 9 foot tall, possibly 700 pounds or more, because that's being conservative. I've never seen such well-defined shoulders before, such an incredibly impressive ripped torso. I wouldn't mind one like that myself. The creature was all muscle, brawn, power and might. She was covered from head to toe with dark brown hair, the colour of a black bear. The creature's face was remarkably human. She had very full, large breasts, which suggested to me she was breastfeeding, so it was clear she was definitely a female. When she saw Sabrina with her baby, she was furious, reacting, I suppose, like a protective mother would. She lifted her thin lips back to reveal these very large human-like teeth. Then she began to growl, her belligerent eyes focusing directly on Sabrina. She then pushed Sabrina back with a powerful hand, which caused her to fall backwards onto the ground with an almighty thud. I don't think that Bigfoot female had any concept of how powerful she was. I mean, a slap from her with one of her hands is possibly equivalent to being slammed across the head with a baseball bat. The creature looked down on Sabrina, who by this time was lying flat on the ground. He spoke to her in this language. I'm not sure what she said, but if I was to guess, I would say she was saying, "Leave me alone, leave my kid alone." I could see she was heartily distressed, a mother who potentially saw Sabrina as a threat. I mean, the way Sabrina was looking at the baby, you could tell she wanted to keep it for herself. That wasn't a good look. Possibly the creature picked up that energy from her. The creature glanced at me briefly, only for a second. I did see a mother's loving eyes that looked flustered, upset, exceedingly protective. The creature turned around, gliding away, with her baby perched on her hips. I ran over to Sabrina, who was lying across the ground, looking rather dazed, confused, and light-headed. She managed to get up, although she hobbled awkwardly. She claimed that her head was really throbbing and pounding, and that she had a violent headache. There was a bit of blood coming out of the side of her head. She said that the hands of the creature swiped her so hard, she was surprised that her head didn't go flying off her neck. She was so horrible, lashing out at me like that. I was concerned about Sabrina, so I decided to go home. But I told her I thought it was a good idea for us to check into the hospital first, to ensure that she was all right. but she assured me she was absolutely fine. It hadn't been too hard a hit. But I wasn't so sure. I wish I'd listened to my gut, but I didn't. I felt that she was more injured than she actually was. We live in apartments next to each other, as you know. Sabrina told me she wanted to go to bed early, as she had a splitting headache, so I gave her some Advil. The next morning when I went to check on her, she was dead. As you can imagine, I just couldn't believe it. I was completely devastated. I still am, but I'm rather numb at the moment, so I'm not really feeling anything right now. I'm still in shock. But I blame myself for not taking her to the hospital. I'm certain she could have been saved. Obviously, it was the injury to the head that caused her demise. Oh my God! Why didn't you call the police? This is nonsensical. It's crazy. And say what? Oh, by the way, my girlfriend was thrashed by a Bigfoot. I mean, let's get real. Are they ever going to believe my story? I ascertained that she must have a blow to the head. I realized that it could be considered a homicide. Anyone could have potentially done it. I would be the most likely candidate to be blamed for the murder, because I was close to Sabrina. She was my girlfriend. I mean, the coroner is going to say her death is a probable homicide, as she had obtained blunt force injury to the head. I know how these detective novels work. I read enough of them. But running away to London, it makes you look guilty. Well, what was I to do? I can't exactly tell the police what I told you. People are ridiculed for believing in Bigfoot. Well, why don't you say she was attacked by a bear? You think I could have said that? My cousin asked. I'm not so sure. Absolutely. Look, I'll do a Google search. Listen to this. When a bear attacks a human, it's likely to go directly for the face or head. It might be advisable to play dead in the circumstances, in order for the bear to see the threat as having gone away, and to leave you alone. If you continue to fight back, you're likely to fight a losing battle. Be very wary of going near mother bears and cubs. Don't you see what you can say? Sabrina was throttled over the head by a bear, played dead. Tell them everything you told me, but replace the baby Bigfoot with a bear cub, and a Bigfoot mother with a mother bear. Explain to them that you panicked when you saw she was dead, thinking you would be blamed for the homicide. To cut a long story short, when my cousin was taken in for questioning by the police, he took my advice, told them everything, admitting the fact that the critter that had thrashed him was a Bigfoot. He explained that he was scared because he felt he'd be accused of the murder. It was very fortunate that my cousin's story was confirmed, as Sabrina had left a voice message for her mother that her mother had overlooked. It said, "Hi, Mum, it's me. I'm not feeling too great. I'm in bed right now. I was hit on the head by a hairy creature today in the woods. I'll tell you all about it when I see you. I was playing with her cub. Got a throbbing headache as a result. But we'll phone you in the morning when I'm feeling better." I think Sabrina must have been rather reluctant to divulge to her own mother that she had seen a Bigfoot, so she referred to it as a critter. Suffice to say, the coroner's report did corroborate that the beating to the head had caused a significant brain bleed, which is significant with a bear attack. Needless to say, my cousin spent the first month in America with me. We grew exceptionally close. He's a very good man who is incapable of even squashing an ant, which I found out to my peril. He then returned to London to stay in my flat for the remainder of the time, while I finished my cooking course in America, then returned home to London, where I currently reside. I have opened my thriving coffee shop in High Street, Kensington, but I am proud to lay claim to the fact that I'm half American, for it is a remarkable, noble land. I also feel privileged to be privy to such a remarkable Bigfoot story, a creature not commonly known by many Brits, so I feel like I'm in on the secret. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.